Hey, I think we're on. So, hey, welcome to another Theological Dust Up hosted by Free Thinking Ministries. I'm Dr. Tim Stratton, and with me once again is Tyson James. How are you doing today, Tyson?
Awesome, man. How are you?
I'm doing great. I'm really enjoying our videos, the Tim and Tyson show. I think people are starting to call it.
Yeah, this has been awesome. Have really enjoyed it.
I have too. And so we're going to continue having an interaction with Dr. James White. And just want to really thank Dr. White for having this exchange with us and making some videos addressing us. So this is, I hope he's enjoying it as much as we are. But let me just say well, before we start, let me invite you, especially you, Tyson, but everybody else, to like this video, share this video, and please subscribe to the Free Thinking Ministries YouTube channel. And you can also learn so much more about the topics that we're going to be discussing today. You can go to reasonablefaith.org. That's Dr. Craig's website. You can also go to my website, freethinkingministries.com. And also, if you want to learn more about Molinism, I invite you, even if you're not a Molinist, to join the Mere Molinism Facebook group. Ask us questions. There have been a lot of people joining and asking really good questions. We invite you to do the same. So that's MERE, Molinism, the Facebook group. Make sure you answer the questions when you, what's the word? I can't think of what I'm trying to say here, Tyson. Help me out.
Apply.
Apply. There, that's a good word. We'll use that. Anyway, I also encourage you to follow us on Instagram and Facebook. We got a new handle. Follow us at Freethink Inc., right? Like Freethink Incorporated. So Freethink Inc., INC. It was Freethink or Die. I kind of like that, but a lot of people were, they were a little too scared of it or something. We sounded too harsh or too aggressive. They didn't like that. So we changed it to Freethink Inc. So make sure you follow us on Instagram and Facebook. And so anyway, today, Tyson and I, like I said, are going to be discussing another video that Dr. James White made, specifically addressing Tyson. Now, Tyson, I got to say, Tyson's been making so many good points in all these videos that we've been doing in this video series. And it kind of seemed like Dr. White was kind of ignoring Tyson a little bit. But finally, Dr. White made two videos specifically targeting Tyson, and his 2018 article found on freethinkingministries.com discussing Psalm 33. Now, Dr. White says that Psalm 33 supports EDD-Calvinism. By EDD, I mean exhaustive divine determinism. Dr. Craig has called it universal divine determinism. By that, we mean that God causally determines everything. And so by causal determinism, we mean that the circumstances or the antecedent conditions are sufficient to necessitate everything that happens. Would you put that differently, Tyson?
No, that's correct. The antecedent conditions are sufficient to causally determine one's choice.
Yeah. So we think there's a lot of problems when somebody affirms that view, and that was the exhaustive divine deterministic view. So Dr. White thinks that Psalm 33 can support his view of exhaustive divine determinism. And Tyson, back in 2018, actually, I think you wrote this before that as a Facebook note, but you said, not so fast. Psalm 33 is actually better evidence or support of libertarian freedom. For the libertarian freedom fighter, we're the ones that get to use Psalm 33 as our biblical support or evidence. So it seems to me that Psalm 33 is kind of like a hostile witness to James White. Dr. White trots Psalm 33 into the courtroom to make his case, but then Psalm 33 turns on the prosecuting attorney while on the stand and winds up making a case for the defendant. In this case, the Molinist, or more specifically, Psalm 33, the inspired word of God, stands up for Tyson James and all libertarian freedom fighters. That would include all the Molinists out there. So White's two videos can be found on his YouTube channel, and they're called Psalm 33 and Tyson James. And Psalm 33, Refutation Concluded, Thoughts on Trinitarian Orthodoxy Over Time. I think I've got both of those links in the description here. Now, finally, I'd be remiss if I did not encourage you to get a copy of my new book, or no, sorry, first get a copy of my old book right here. That's called Human Freedom, Divine Knowledge, and Mere Molinism. But the new book I don't even have yet, but it's available on Amazon. And that's called The Mere Molinism Study Guide, which I co-authored with Tim Fox. It was published and hit Amazon on Christmas Day. And I believe I have the link to that in the description as well. Well, today, with all that said, since Dr. White had Tyson James in his sights for these two videos, I want to let Tyson do most of the talking today. So, Tyson, would you tell us a little bit about the backstory behind your Psalm 33 article?
Yeah, so White did a dividing line where he decided to take Psalm 33 as a proof text against libertarian free will. And after listening to that, I thought that was terrible. So I wrote a Facebook note and talked to some of my friends about it and shared it around a little bit there. But I guess it didn't come to White's attention, and so I think you invited me to publish that article on the Free Thinking Ministries website in 2018 after I brought it up again because these issues keep coming up. And so we published it on the website, and it got his attention. And he actually said, White said on Twitter, he had read it, and he said he was going to respond to it on the dividing line, and he never did. And so in one of our previous videos, I mentioned that he had never gotten back to that. And so I guess he felt compelled to rectify the situation. And so he did two videos. One was completely about my article, and the second one was about half of it was finishing up his analysis of the argument.
So again, you originally wrote that as a Facebook note. What year was that? 2014.
Just after he did his podcast.
Interesting. Okay, so just to clarify, you weren't specifically arguing for Molinism or that middle knowledge is found in this passage, right? Tyson. Tyson, are you there? Well, this is weird. He is frozen.
It was White's task.
Oh, Tyson, can you hear me?
All right,
man, we were doing really well, and then you froze up.
Yeah.
For a while.
Okay.
So let's try this again. I was asking you. I said, just to clarify, you weren't arguing specifically for Molinism or that middle knowledge is found in this passage, correct?
Correct. Yeah. Okay. So it was White who was saying in his podcast that Psalm 33 is a proof text against libertarian freedom. And so my note, which eventually turned into the article, was specifically saying that it doesn't work as a proof text. So it wasn't my point to say that Psalm 33 is a proof text for Molinism, just that it was not a proof text against libertarian freedom. And so that was mainly his task. His burden of proof was showing that that text precludes libertarian freedom.
Got it. Okay. So yeah, anything else you want to say on that before we jump to the 29-minute mark?
Yeah, so just wanted to clarify too that in order for Psalm 33 to work as a proof text against libertarian freedom, White would need to show A, that he understands libertarian free will, and B, that the text actually does preclude libertarian free will as an interpretive option, right? It has to say something that completely eliminates libertarian freedom as an option. Okay. As I think will be shown, White does not accomplish either of those tasks. And So because he doesn't understand libertarian freedom and he hasn't shown in the text why it's precluded, it leaves libertarian freedom as an interpretive option and Molinism as untouched by his critique, and still open and a viable option for explaining the biblical data.
All right. All right. Okay. Well, let's go to the 29-minute mark. And White says, God fashions the hearts of man. Well, Tyson, do you disagree with that?
No, I do agree that God fashions the hearts of man. What this phrase does not explain free will or not, right? It just doesn't say. And note in the passage in Psalm 33, the following line says, God understands or discerns their deeds and works. So it doesn't say that God causally determines man's deeds or works. It says that he understands them. And this is perfectly compatible with our having libertarian free will.
Yeah. You know, I find it amusing that so many assume that just because God created a creature, that there must be, or there must only be one thing that this created being can actually do or think in a certain situation, that there can only be one thing compatible with a person's nature in a specific circumstance and time. Well, why can't God create humans to have opportunities to exercise an ability to choose between a range of options, each of which is compatible with a person's nature in a circumstance where the antecedent conditions are insufficient to necessitate the person's choice? And here I'm thinking of the kind of person described in 1 Corinthians 10:13, for example. What do you think?
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. I think 1 Corinthians 10:13 does suggest that at least Christians have a range of options available to them, which is sufficient for libertarian freedom. Of course, there are some libertarian free will proponents who don't even think you need more than one option, right?
Right.
Libertarian freedom is all about how we choose, not the number of choices in front of us.
Yes.
So if we talk about the principle of alternative possibilities, those who affirm libertarian freedom can affirm a principle of alternative possibilities, or they don't have to, right? It's
Right.
all about the causal account of choosing.
And I don't know if Dr. White understands this. He definitely needs to address both of these issues, both kinds of libertarian freedom.
Right.
So anyway, White says at 30:27, he says, there would be no me without the decree. How do you respond, Tyson?
There would be no me without the decree. I agree. Yes, there would be no us without the decree. That still doesn't mean that we were created without libertarian freedom.
Yeah. Well, then 3 seconds later, he says, there would be no me to be known without the decree. What do you think?
Molinism doesn't posit that there's a me to be known without the decree, right? This is supposed to be, middle knowledge is supposed to be pre-decree knowledge. So there is no us pre-decree, right? Molinism just posits that God knows that he can create me, that he can create me a free creature, and that he knows prior to the decree what I would freely do in a circumstance. So if our non-existence, and think about this, if our non-existence stops God from having middle knowledge, then it's unclear why our non-existent doesn't also stop God from having natural knowledge or knowledge of the creatures he can create, right? Because they don't exist yet. So if our non-existence doesn't stop God from knowing that he can create us, then it would be inconsistent for White to say that our non-existence stops God from knowing what we would freely do were he to create us.
That's right. All right, moving on to 32:42. White says he's not forming these creatures to fit into a plan. What they will do is already a fixed reality. What do you think?
So I really want people to listen to this and hear the wording here. He says he's not forming these creatures to fit into a plan. What they will do is already a fixed reality. Okay, there's a shift here, a subtle shift from subjunctive conditionals which is what creatures would do were God to create them, to what's called a future indicative.
Mm.
A future indicative is what will happen, or in this case, what creatures will do. Okay. Here, White's using the future indicative. He's not talking about subjunctive conditionals.
Mm-hmm.
So logically, prior to the decree, there simply isn't any fact of the matter about how we will choose, right? Because how we will choose is dependent on God's decree to create, and he
Right.
hasn't decreed that yet, right?
Mm-hmm.
Pre-decree. He could just as easily have decided to not create or to create different creatures altogether.
Yeah. Yeah. And actually, Tyson, didn't you mention in our last discussion, I think, that you recently watched a video in which White says that he doesn't know whether God could have decided to refrain from creation? Something like that?
Yeah, I did see that video, and actually, the question was put directly to him: can God choose not to create? And he said he did not know. So I thought that was very strange. But
Yeah.
anyway, yeah, go ahead.
That seems to be a strike against omnipotence.
Right. Yeah, that God must create. That kind of seems like those are the
Yeah.
only options. Either he must create, or he has the freedom to refrain from creating.
Yeah.
Yeah,
And White, go ahead.
I was just going to say that since there are no other beings in existence at that point, there's nothing, putting any sort of constraint on God that he must do this or that.
And it's weird for me to hear White say that he doesn't know if God could refrain from creation, because he seems to want to say that God is the potter with all this freedom, that God is the one with libertarian freedom. So it seems that if the potter really does have libertarian freedom, then he would be free to create or not. He would be free to refrain from creation.
Right.
Anyway.
Yeah. So
anything else
another
you want
thing to add, was that I don't know why Molinists can't say that God is forming us to fit into a plan. Like White's saying that we don't have that as an option, and I don't understand where that follows. If God wants to include free creatures in his plan, why couldn't he?
Yeah.
Right? If God wants to include free creatures and it's logically incoherent to say that God can cause someone to freely choose something, then it just follows that the creation of free creatures would entail that our free choices are not causally determined by God.
Mm-hmm.
Yet with middle knowledge, of course, God can providentially plan exactly how history unfolds, right? We have a strong, robust doctrine of providence, and that includes the free choices of his creatures. And I think as we go along here, we'll see White claims that God cannot create free creatures because he makes this confusion between ontology, or the order of being, and volition, or the will. And so that's going to be a key confusion that if he were to resolve that, I think would eliminate a lot of his problems in understanding Molinism.
Yeah, agreed. All right, at 3250, looking at William Lane Craig, his point was that God's will does not determine this, so his freedom is delimited as to what world he will actuate, what's feasible given something outside of himself. Go ahead, Tyson.
Yeah, so I wanted to focus specifically on this phrase, given something outside of himself, right? That was the phrase White uses. And this is a huge error. Molinists have always maintained that God has middle knowledge logically prior to the divine creative decree, right? He has this knowledge intrinsically because he knows that he can create free creatures. And since this knowledge is pre-decree, there just aren't any creatures outside of God.
Dang it.
They're creatures. It's pre-decree.
Hey. All right, you froze up. You said since this knowledge is pre-decreed, what? Are you frozen again?
All right, am I back yet?
Okay, now you're back. Sorry about that.
Okay, no problem. So God has middle knowledge pre-decree, and pre-decree means there's no creatures in existence yet, right? Right? He hasn't decided to create anything yet. So there's no creatures that God gains his middle knowledge from, right? He just has it intrinsically. So where is White getting this phrase, given something outside of himself? He's like assuming something here. And what I think it is he has a perceptualist view of divine cognition. And what do I mean by that? Well, it seems like White thinks that on Molinism, God looks at something like creaturely essences or possible worlds or something, and kind of like the way that we would look out a window and see a tree or something, the external world or something. So that's the perceptualist view. Molinists like Dr. Craig and myself, and maybe are you a perception or a conceptualist? I don't know.
Yeah.
We affirm a conceptualist view, where God simply conceives in his mind the various free creatures that he can create and the circumstances that he could put them in. And via his middle knowledge, he simply knows how these free creatures would choose in those various circumstances. So it's not a matter of looking at something and gaining information from it. It's God in his own mind conceiving of the creatures he can create and knowing how they would freely choose in a particular circumstance. So on the conceptualist model, there's just no sense in which God is being delimited by something that exists outside of himself.
Right. All right, at the 34-minute mark, he says, middle knowledge comes from God's nature, but not from his will. It's almost as if God is forced to know, because he's omniscient, what creatures he has not created would do, but he can't change what they would do. Go ahead.
Yeah. This is obviously prejudicial language. God is forced to know.
Right.
This isn't really any more problematic than saying that God cannot change the outcome of 2 + 2 = 4, right? Is he forced to know that? That seems like a weird way to say it, but in a way, yes. It's just a necessary mathematical truth. 2 + 2 = 4. There's no possible state of affairs in which 2 + 2 does not equal 4. Just as there's no possible state of affairs in which God does not exist, or God sins, or God creates another God, like all of these things that we say are impossible. And that's because by God's very nature, he cannot do the logically impossible. And we don't say that because God can't negate these truths, that he's forced to know something, right? That's just weird to say about those necessary truths. So since it's logically impossible for God to cause a creature to freely do something, there's simply nothing objectionable about saying that God can't change what a free creature would freely do in a particular circumstance. So to say that it's objectionable is really the equivalent of saying God should be able to do the logically impossible, like making himself cease to exist, or his sinning, or creating another God, which is absurd.
Yeah. Which is basically the point that I was making in the very first video I did, immediately following White's video that he did when he was talking about the fatal flaw of Molinism. And this was before everybody saw the debate between Dr. Craig and Dr. White. Again, not technically a debate, the moderated conversation on the Unbelievable show. Before anybody saw that, Dr. White came out and made a video talking about his pre-recorded conversation with Dr. Craig. And I was pointing that out too. It's like, really, Dr. White's main objection here is just saying, hey, God can't do the logically impossible. Well, big deal. Okay, so going on to 35:16, White continues to say that on Molinism, the Legos are not designed by God. They're not a function of his will. They're a function of his nature. And then he says, I've not seen Craig say that, but that's what Stratton is saying. Help him out.
Yeah, so he's just showing his unfamiliarity with Dr. Craig's work on this. So from the October 14th, 2017 podcast titled Is Molinism Biblical? Dr. Craig says this. He says, quote, I do think that it is essential to God to have middle knowledge. That's what he says, end quote. So yes, Dr. Craig does think that middle knowledge is a function of God's nature and not of his will.
Yeah. And as I explained to Dr. White on Twitter the other day, we were having another back and forth. And I tweeted, quote, if perfect power and perfect knowledge are necessary attributes of God, then middle knowledge comes along for the ride, end quote. So if White wants to remain committed to a rejection of God's middle knowledge, then White must reject either that God is necessarily perfect in power or that God is necessarily perfect in knowledge, or both. Anything you'd like to add to that?
No.
All right. Well, yeah, we're having some fun Twitter exchanges. So I'll tell you
I
what,
just want to
Twitter.
say I apologize for my Taco Bell level Wi-Fi issues. I bought a Wi-Fi pod yesterday, and it had cleared up things. It is a little bit better than it was, but for some reason I'm still having issues. So I hope you guys will bear with me.
Yeah, it's weird because before we went live, everything was going great, and we hit that live button, and boom, we got problems. So we'll keep working on it. But all right, let's go to the 36:27 mark. And White continues and says, "There's only one with autonomy, and that's God. So the point here is that there is only one free will. There can only be one autonomous will, because to create a second autonomous will is to create another God, because you're creating something that is no longer dependent upon God." Yeah, he's got us there. What do you think?
Still there?
Yeah. Go ahead and respond.
All right. So this is really weird. Apparently, to White, the creation of free creatures entails the creation of something which is not dependent on God.
Mm.
This, of course, this is absurd, right? It's a gross mischaracterization of Molinism. No Molinist claims that free creatures are somehow not dependent on God, right?
Right.
Our very choosing, our choices, require that God sustains our existence. Otherwise, we would not exist in order to choose.
Right.
So it's not the case that if God creates free creatures, that they're somehow not dependent on him anymore.
Mm-hmm.
And as I said, God could have chosen not to create us at all. So there's, that is his choice whether or not to create us. Or he could have created us in different circumstances with different outcomes, right? He's completely in charge of that. So whatever the case, it doesn't entail, Molinism doesn't entail that God causally determines our choices, nor does it entail that we're no longer dependent on God.
Yeah. Now, Tyson, after Dr. White said that all truths are created by God, I'm getting him right. Didn't he say that all truths are created by God at one point?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay.
And he cited Colossians 1 to that
Right.
effect.
Yeah. So White says that all truths are created by God. And then you and I offered a long list of truths that are not up to God, not up to God's creative decree. And I noted that God cannot choose to add a fourth person to the Godhead and become a quadrinity, even if he wanted to, right? So we don't say that God's delimited by this truth that's not up to him. But with the quadrinity in mind, White responds at 36:49, and he says, "We all agree that God can't create another God. The Trinity can't become the quadrinity, because these are necessary statements of the existence of God, and he does not change." Go ahead.
Yeah, this is a really interesting statement because, like we said in the previous videos, White has maintained that God created all truths. He didn't qualify that. He said all truths are created by God. And if God created all truths, then there simply are no necessary statements of the existence of God, right? Because they're all contingent on God's will. So either White is being inconsistent now about whether or not God created all truths, or he's implying that God's will is necessary and couldn't have been otherwise, which is inconsistent with his prior claim that only God has libertarian freedom. And if God has libertarian freedom, then it's not the case that God's will is necessary and couldn't have been otherwise. So either way, he's being inconsistent. It's just which way his inconsistency goes.
Right. This is definitely not being a good systematic theologian here. To be a good systematic theologian, you want all of your theological beliefs to be consistent with each other and to not violate to have one belief not violate another. And there's a lot of inconsistency going on here. But not only is he inconsistent, but Dr. White has repeatedly shown that he does not understand Molinism. He does not grasp what we mean by libertarian freedom. And now he seems to think that we don't understand Colossians 1, which is one of my favorite passages of scripture. I'm sure you like it too. but White says at 37:20, he says, I want to go back and look at what Craig has said on Colossians 1. It certainly sounds like he was saying what I've said about Colossians 1 and not what James and Stratton have said about Colossians 1. So how would you respond to that charge, Tyson?
Yeah, well, just, since I work for Dr. Craig and know his work better than White, it's really just a matter of citation. So Dr. Craig cites Colossians 1 in Defenders, Doctrine of the Trinity, parts 2 and 3, Doctrine of Creation, parts 8 and 22, and in his article, God and Abstract Objects. So he mentions Colossians 1 there, and you can kind of sum up his view with something that he says at the end of an article titled Propositional Truth, Who Needs It? There he says, quote, the answer is, who needs propositional truth? And he's answering the question. Certainly not God. Indeed, we don't need propositional truth either. All we need to truly describe the world as it is the truth predicate, and that will not saddle us with any Platonistic commitments. Basically, he's saying we can have the truth predicate, and that doesn't commit us to objects out there, abstract or concrete, called truths. Yeah. So, of course, if truths are not objects, then they are not objects of creation because they don't exist. So they don't fall under the scope of Colossians 1, right? So no, Dr. Craig isn't saying what White is saying about Colossians 1. He's not affirming that Colossians 1 says anything about whether or not truths are objects that are created. And White he's seemingly reading his objectual view of truth into the text rather than out of it, right? Colossians 1 doesn't say anything about God creating truth. It does say that God created all things, right? All things were created through him. But it doesn't say what all those things are, right? You have to go out and find out what those things are. It doesn't say subatomic particles. It doesn't say quasars, right? So you have to actually investigate what things actually exist. And Dr. Craig, I think, has written a lot motivating the idea that truth is not an object which exists.
Once again here, it seems like James White is unwittingly assuming a philosophical view, and then he imposes it upon the text of Scripture. Now, this is the epitome of eisegesis, but James White wants us all to believe that he's an expert in exegesis. Now, this is really too bad. And look, White is damaging his ministry by abandoning careful exegetical principles and exchanging them for eisegesis while continuing to claim that he's just exegeting the text. Well, look, by making these repeated errors, Dr. White is quickly losing credibility. And look, by pointing this out, we're not seeking to destroy Dr. White's ministry. We're trying to save it. And Dr. White, just let me speak to you directly here for a moment. You need to recognize the error of your ways here, and you need to cease and desist. I just finished grading a dissertation this week at Trinity Theological Seminary, and the student cited you and your work to make his point. It was on an unrelated theological issue. But look, if this continues, you're calling this exegesis, but this is clearly eisegesis. And if this continues, why would students continue to cite your work when everyone can see just how sloppy you're being in this regard right now? Look, I say that out of love, brother. Tyson and I want the best for you. We really do. So we're not doing this in an attempt to bring down James White. No, we appreciate your ministry, but you're really shooting yourself in the foot here, and we don't want you to do that. Anyway, I digress. Let's get back to what Dr. White said in the video. At 38:12, he says, God has an autonomous will. God is free and the nature of his autonomy. And if we want to use the term libertarian free will, yes, is completely different than any human will. Go ahead, Tyson.
Well, I would just say his point here isn't entirely clear. We've already said that our wills are contingent on God sustaining our existence. So, of course, our wills are not like God's in that is to really imply that we're not even using the same concept of will in both instances, and that's absurd. Both God and man have wills, just as both God and man have power, knowledge, rationality, etc. So if the concepts of these things are completely different between God and man, and there's no univocal element, no element where they touch, then we can't even say that God has power, knowledge, and rationality. White might say, yes, we're talking about the same concept, but only God's will is autonomous, right? That seems to be his go-to.
Yeah.
But according to White's previous explanation of autonomy, what he means by autonomy is not dependent. And as I've already said, Molinists affirm that our wills are dependent on God's causally sustaining our existence. So our having free will doesn't mean that we're autonomous in that sense. It does mean that we're autonomous in the sense that God doesn't cause us to freely choose things.
Yes.
But why is that problematic? It's not like God is forced to create free creatures or to create the circumstances as they are in the actual world. But if he does decide to create free creatures, then it follows that he can't causally determine what they freely choose. That's logically incoherent.
Yeah.
And omnipotence doesn't include the power to do whatever is logically incoherent.
Yeah, I love the fact that you're being careful and precise in this conversation, Tyson. It's vital to recognize the fact that some words can be used in multiple ways, and then we can distinguish the senses of the word, lest one unwittingly conflate two different senses of the word. With that in mind, I would just add that there are some differences. Go ahead.
I was just going to say, I just saw that my friend Travis Eccles there, he noted that he basically said, unless you use analogical language, saying that maybe you can say that God's will is completely different from man's will, and we're just using will analogically. The problem is that in analogical language, you still have to have a univocal element. You still have to have a point at where those concepts meet. Otherwise, there's no analog. There's no way to say this is similar to this, right? There has to be that point of similarity. So even in analogical language, if you're using will to mean, two things, there has to be some point at which they're the same. Otherwise, it's not an analog. That's the whole point of an analog, is that it's somehow the same as that which is being compared to.
Cool. Very good. So I just wanted to add that because you brought up rationality, and I would add that there's some differences between God and man when it comes to the different senses of the word rationality. For example, I've put it this way in the past. Let me read it here. To the degree that a human engages in reasoning and approximates to the perfect standard of knowledge, to that same degree, a human is rational. To the degree that a human fails to approximate to God's perfect standard of knowledge, to that same degree, a human is irrational or non-rational. So, in a sense, we can say that God is non-rational since he does not engage in the use of reason like humans do. A necessary omniscient being does not infer best explanations after considering all the data. In another sense, however, God is perfectly rational or reasonable since none of his beliefs are logically contradictory, right? All of his beliefs fit together perfectly. In that sense, God is perfectly logical, reasonable, and rational. So I just wanted to throw that out there. So let's get back to White. 38:24, he says, there's a fundamental difference between God's knowledge and man's knowledge. For example, which I don't believe is actually something that Dr. Craig does believe. What do you think?
I can't believe he actually said that. It's just really laughable. He's making the claim that he thinks that Dr. Craig doesn't believe there's a difference between God's knowledge and man's knowledge.
Yeah.
I don't see how he gets that at all. Does he really think that Dr. Craig affirms that man is omniscient, or that man has middle knowledge, which is logically prior to the creative decree? I mean, how can man, a creature, possibly have knowledge of anything prior to the creative decree, or prior to being created? Come on, like, we can be serious. That's not a serious claim.
Right. And again, Dr. White's not doing himself any favors by employing these tactics. I mean, look, we want James White to succeed and flourish as a theologian, but these dishonest, these tactics are taking a toll on his trustworthiness. And indeed, if he continues to proceed in this manner, James White is going to destroy the ministry that God has blessed him with. And I think he continues these kinds of errors at 3908, where he says the beginning of this psalm begins with God's creation of all things, which includes mankind. So it is a given in the text. It's not ad hoc. How would you respond, Tyson?
Well, the reason he says it's not ad hoc was because in my article, what I noted was ad hoc was not at all about White's assertion that God creates all things. So his response here just doesn't even address what I'm saying in my article. What I said in the article was that White admits that there's parallelism in the passage between God's choices, right? God makes his plans, and man's choices, man's plans. And he says that God's choices or plans are made via libertarian freedom, but then he drops that parallelism when it comes to man's plans. And this is because he doesn't even know what libertarian freedom means. He thinks it means something like man exists or chooses independently of God's sustaining power. And that's just not what libertarian freedom means, right? Again, libertarian free will is the ability to choose such that antecedent conditions are insufficient to causally determine one's choice. At most, what the passage says would preclude White's mistaken view of libertarian freedom, not what Molinists actually mean by the term. So if his concept of libertarian freedom isn't the one that Molinists are using, then what good is it to say that this is a proof text against Molinism? He doesn't even understand the position that he's attacking.
What a great point. And it's really quite odd that White would continue to make such mistakes, though. I mean, because you and I, in multiple videos that he's been responding to, we've clearly defined what we mean by libertarian freedom. So it really doesn't make any sense for him to continue making these mistakes or to not understand what is meant by libertarian freedom, at least what the Molinist means by libertarian freedom. We've defined what we mean by libertarian freedom. We've carefully defined what we mean by causal determinism. And we've asked Dr. White to carefully define what he means by these terms so that we don't talk past each other, but we're still waiting. However, at 3957, White says, now, how many people do you think who first read the 33rd Psalm thought of this type of objection? I would say not a single one. What do you think?
Yeah, this is a really strange statement. First, it's not an objection. I don't know where he's getting that. I noted that the parallelism in the passage suggests that our choices are made by us, not God causally determining us to choose. And what I've been objecting to is White's illicit use of this passage as a proof text against libertarian freedom. I just don't think that the first readers of this passage were thinking about causal accounts of choices at all, much less exhaustive divine causal determinism.
Right.
So that's just probably not what they were thinking about, even though we can assess the passage in those terms. So, but notice something else. Notice that by White's same logic, if people weren't thinking about exhaustive divine causal determinism, then that's also not something that we can derive from the passage.
Mm.
So is he going to say that they were thinking about that or not? I think it would be eisegesis to say that they were.
Right.
And then also the first readers weren't thinking about things like subatomic particles. So does that mean that the only things that fall under creation of all things in the passage does not include subatomic particles? Of course not. So this idea that libertarian freedom isn't in the passage because the first readers weren't thinking about causal accounts of choices, that's just silly.
And describing this as silly might be the understatement of 2021. So, Dr. White, Dr. White continues and exclaims at 4034, in the Molinist world, you either have autonomy or you have puppets. What do you think, Tyson?
Well, I just have to note first that in the video, if you go back and listen to it, this is at 4034, you said, this is one of those times where White really cranks the volume up to 11. He starts getting, more and more excited and, more and more thrashing about. I just want to say that more volume and rhetoric really doesn't make one's case stronger. So if that's a tactic that you use, maybe rein that back a bit. He's apparently really triggered when Molinists use puppets as an analogy for causal determinism.
Mm-hmm.
I haven't used that analogy in my responses to him, but in any case, as we've seen, White's idea of autonomy is ontological, right? He thinks that autonomy means our existence is independent of God somehow.
Right.
And Molinists reject that. So he's really attacking a non-Molinist position.
Mm-hmm.
What we have said is that our choices are either deterministic or indeterministic. Either we have libertarian freedom or our choices are causally necessitated by antecedent conditions.
Yeah.
And so far, White hasn't shown that Psalm 33 teaches that our choices are causally deterministic. And that was the whole point of his using this as a proof text against Molinism, was to show that we don't have libertarian freedom. So he hasn't carried the burden of proof.
Yeah. And based upon the logical law of the excluded middle, either our thoughts, actions, and choices are always causally determined by God in some form or fashion, or they aren't. And so there's no middle ground there. And if God always causally determines every thought, action, and choice, then Ed could be true. But if God does not, if God causally determines everything, which would include every human thought, action, and choice, then Ed is true. But if God does not causally determine every human thought, action, and choice, then Ed is false, and humans have libertarian freedom. But next, Dr. White jumps into the deep philosophical waters and metaphysics of time, which, unlike William Lane Craig, I don't think Dr. White has contributed to the philosophy of time literature. Dr. Craig, on the other hand, has written volumes on this topic. But with that said, White exclaims at the 41-minute mark, he says, all of the biblical richness of the fact that the eternal God creates time as the theater in which he reveals his attributes to his people is wiped away. It's either all those people are little autonomous gods themselves, or they are just puppets on strings. There is nothing in between. God is not big enough. He does not have the power to create the temporal creation as the sphere of the drama of redemption. As I've said over and over again, he then enters into his own creation. The second person of the Trinity subjects himself to time. That means time is real. We're not puppets. And if you guys don't stop thinking about determinism as some simplistic puppet, God just pulling the strings and inserting thoughts in the heart, you will never get close to providing a meaningful argument against what we believe. Well, looks like he's got you there, Tyson.
Oh, yeah. Well, I hope I'm not the only one that was completely confused by this section. It's hard to make heads or tails of it because it seems incoherent, but it seems like, if I can kind of dig through there, it seems like he's suggesting that Molinists think that on determinism, time isn't real.
Right.
That's kind of weird. Like, I don't see how he gets that. Of course, the operation of puppets, if we think about puppetry, the operation of puppets is temporal. So of course time is real on determinism.
Yeah.
But anyway, as I've said in previous videos, we have to carefully distinguish between what a view claims and what it implies. So White may object to our pointing out that on determinism, God is pulling strings and inserting thoughts into the heart, but that's exactly what his view implies, right?
Yeah.
Whether he wants to admit it or not. So as it pertains to the passage and my article, his task was to show that Psalm 33 precludes or eliminates libertarian freedom. And so far, there's just no good reason to accept that claim, and really good reason to reject it, despite his claims to the contrary.
Yeah. All right. Well, at the 43-minute mark, he says, if you can look at Acts 4:27 through 28 and look at the centrality of the drama of redemption of Pilate and Herod and the Romans and the Jews, and just go, oh, well, if that's just determinism, then it was just simply their being forced to do what they did. No, he says, there doesn't have to be any force. God's sovereignty is so beautiful and so powerful and so righteous and so glorious that not only did Pilate do what his nature led him to do, now God's restraining. He's fallen man. He's fallen Adam. He has a corrupt heart. He has a heart of stone. So God will restrain that heart of stone from doing things that he doesn't want. Go ahead, Tyson.
Yeah, so you hear that there, right? On the one hand, White says that if man's choices are free, then he is a God.
Yeah.
And since he takes it as impossible for God to create another God, right, this implies that it's impossible for man to have free will. But then on the other hand, he says here that there doesn't have to be any force in man's choosing or doing what he does. But that's exactly what determinism is. It's causally necessitating a choice or action. This is why the language of restraint, God restraining evil, is just so awkward and inconsistent when it's combined with determinism. What exactly is God restraining if man doesn't have free will? If God doesn't cause it to happen, it's not going to happen, whether or not God restrains or not. Like that, it just doesn't make any sense.
And I like, Calvinists often object to when we use the word force, so like, oh, you're on your view that God is forcing something. But what you said there, you said that's exactly what determinism is. It's causally necessitating a choice or action. And that's what we mean by force, I think. Did I quote you right on that?
Right. Yeah. Absolutely.
Yeah.
And,
so I don't
and
think
on determinism.
Go ahead.
Oh, can you hear me?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. Yeah, that's exactly right. What I was going to say is on determinism, you have to ask the question, why is it that man has the nature that he has, right? White brought up the fact that man is fallen and that he has a fallen nature and that his heart is corrupt. Why is it on determinism that man has the nature that he has? Why did Adam fall? Why does man now have a corrupt heart and a heart of stone? It's because on determinism, God causally necessitates it. That is exactly why the charge sticks that on determinism, God is the author of evil. It's because God moves the will to sin. He holds creatures responsible for the sin that he moves their wills to do. And that's exactly why more and more people are saying, hold on. That's not what's going on in the Bible. That is not consistent with God is love. And that's why I think more and more people are realizing that it's actually Molinism that's more compatible with Scripture than determinism.
Yeah, I'd like to add a couple things here. First, going back to White's claim that it's God who is restraining. What was he saying there? That God is restraining.
Yeah, he's restraining evil.
Yeah. Okay. Well, God, on White's view, God seems to be restraining his own actions. Restraining what he has previously causally determined. And that just seems absurd when you think about it. And to me, that seems like I think I've talked about this before in one of our one of our videos, but it seems like that's like a mad scientist creating and programming and causally determining, say, a giant robot to go destroy the city. And only the mad scientist has the power to reprogram or restrain the robot, and then sets the robot on course to destroy the city. And after the robot has destroyed, half the city or so, the mad scientist steps in and flips a switch or pushes a button to slow down the robot's destruction. And then the mad scientist proclaims to the remaining citizens, "Look, I've restrained evil. I should be praised." Well, of course not. The mad scientist should go to jail for causally determining all the calamity in the first place. But according to White's EDD-Calvinism, this is what we seem to be left with when saying that God restrains evil. And also, to your point, Tyson, you mentioned that more and more people are starting to see this inconsistency of Calvinism. And I'm contacted by people, Tyson, almost weekly into our website or over Facebook or over email or whatever. Almost weekly, people telling me that they've left Calvinism for Molinism because the Calvinist view simply can't make sense of all the biblical data. Indeed, one might even say that the Calvinist position is crazier than a hoot owl. But speaking of hoot owls, at 4405, White said this, "But then you've got crazy Herod. I'm sorry, but if anyone proves the functional idea of middle knowledge is foolishness, Herod does. Are you really telling me that there is a Herod floating around out there that would always do the same thing in every circumstance you put him in? Herod was a nut. He was crazier than a hoot owl. And you put Herod in the same circumstance on the same day, he's going to do 27 different things, and nobody's going to know what it is. But God is sovereign, even over a crazy man like Herod." What do you think, Tyson?
Well, you mentioned that he said Herod was crazier than a hoot owl.
Right.
Interesting fact about the phrase "crazier than a hoot owl." That phrase came about because the hoot owl emanates a jarring cry when it's getting territorial. But anyway, I don't really know what to make of this section, other than White thinks that Molinists are committed to essences being actual people floating around out in space somewhere, and that someone in the same circumstance on the same day can do something different.
Right. I mean, Tyson, are Molinists committed to the actual existence of the essence of James White floating around out there?
Well, first, Molinists are not committed to essences, much less essences of actual people floating around out in space. Dr. Craig himself is an anti-realist regarding essences, which is part and parcel of his anti-realism regarding abstract objects.
Yeah.
Second, White is really unfamiliar with the proper usage of possible world semantics, and so he doesn't realize that were the same person put into the same circumstances on the same day, feasible world.
Tyson, got to rewind you.
You sorry.
Said, start with your second point again.
Okay, yeah. So the second point was that White is unfamiliar with the proper usage of possible world semantics. Yeah. And so he doesn't realize that if it were the same person put into the same circumstances on the same day, it would have the same outcome, because you're just describing the same possible or same feasible world with the same truth values of the subjunctive conditionals or the counterfactuals of creaturely freedom. Mm-hmm. So if it was some subsequent instance, like some later time, but a similar circumstance at a different time, then it could have a different outcome, because the passage of time makes that circumstance completely different. Yeah. So whatever Herod would do in a later situation is really irrelevant to whether he would do this or that in the first situation.
Yeah, and I'm glad you pointed that out, Tyson, because, well, for those in the audience, I highly let me recommend rewinding the video and listening to Tyson's second point a few times here, the one that I had him repeat, because this clarification will surely alleviate much confusion. And speaking of rewinding, even if it were possible, tell me what you think about this, Tyson. But even, people bring up the rewinding time objection, if you will, quite a bit.
Yeah.
But even if it were possible to rewind time, the same libertarian free creature in the same circumstance would still freely, in a libertarian sense, choose to do the exact same thing. Does that sound right?
Yeah, so it depends on what you mean by rewinding time. But if
Right.
you're talking about just, literally going back to the exact time in the past and the same circumstances and everything, then it's not, there's nothing about that circumstance that's different.
Yeah.
So you're going to get the same counterfactuals. God knows via his middle knowledge what you would freely do in that situation. So if there's a truth value to that, God knows it, and he's always going to know it. It doesn't matter if you rewind time or not.
That's right. That's right. And you don't lose your libertarian freedom just because So, all right. White continues at 44:45 and says, and the beauty of the fact that he has created time as the theater in which he demonstrates all these things. You guys take that, smacks the table. You guys take that down into a flat little piece of paper, determinism. How do they make these plans? They made those plans as creatures, and given that he's talking about in general the nations around Israel, they made those plans as idolaters, as fallen sons and daughters of Adam. They made those plans out of the hearts of stone to aggrandize themselves like Nebuchadnezzar. What do you think?
Again, we agree with White that they made those plans as creatures. The question is, were they creatures created with free will or not? If not, why did they make those plans, and how did they make those plans? On determinism, their plans are not caused by themselves. They're caused by God.
Yeah.
Their choosing evil plans is causally necessitated by factors over which they have absolutely no control, no input. And ironically, it's White's determinism that flattens us into little pieces of paper. As you, Tim, have pointed out, determinism does away with the very thing that allows for robust rationality, morality, love relationships, right? So you get rid of free will and you get rid of all of those things. That seems to be a much flatter conception of humanity than what we have. And again, White seems to be under the mistaken impression that having a fallen nature somehow precludes free will. What is the reasoning there? Well, it's because he falsely assumes that to say you have free will, you have to deny a fallen nature. But again, that's not actually paying attention to how we're defining free will. The definition of free will, again, is the ability to choose such that antecedent conditions are insufficient to causally determine one's choice. That definition is all about the causal account of choosing, not about which options are before us. So let's just say that it's true that in our fallen nature, we will only choose evil, right? Let's just grant that for the sake of argument. I don't think it's true, but let's just give it. What about that claim demonstrates that we can't choose those evils freely, like Adam? So far, I've not seen any reason to think that's the case. And given that we're held responsible for the evil that we choose, it seems logical to conclude that we are not causally necessitated to choose evil. So we do actually have real input on whether or not we choose evil. And I think that's what preserves
All right, you said something about preserves.
Oh, yeah, I said free will is what I think preserves God's goodness and holds us morally accountable. It puts us in our place, so to speak.
Yeah. All right. Anything else you want to say there?
Oh, yeah. So regarding Nebuchadnezzar, so Molinists say that I should say no Molinist says that God cannot cause us to act like animals. And we've got this episode with Nebuchadnezzar where he props himself up and then God basically makes him act like a beast and he's out there eating grass. So perhaps during this time of humiliation, Nebuchadnezzar didn't actually have free will. That's
Right.
a possibility, and that might even be suggested by this later statement from Nebuchadnezzar, where he says that his reason returned to him. So that might suggest that his free will came back. I don't know.
Right.
But
I think you're onto something.
yeah, so but note that this was a judgment that God brought against him for something that he had already done.
Right.
Namely,
Exactly.
sinning against God by pridefully proclaiming his own glory and sovereignty as if he were not dependent on God and therefore stood outside his sovereignty. So if God causally determined Nebuchadnezzar to make these blasphemous claims, then it was God who forced, yes, forced, right? That's accurate terminology here. He forced the king to do evil. But that's just what determinism implies, that God forced him to do that.
Yeah.
And White may not like that language, but if he's going to be intellectually consistent, then I think this is something that he must admit. And it's interesting, White, whenever the term force is brought up, he compares that language of force to having a gun to one's head and being compelled to do something. But actually, what's interesting is that on determinism, it's even stronger than that, since if you have a gun to your head, you can still choose to be shot in the head rather than do whatever they want you to do, right? On determinism, it's actually more like, somebody putting a gun in your hand and then turning your arm so that the gun is pointing at someone, and then pulling the trigger with your finger, all while manipulating your mind to make you think that you want to kill that person.
Yeah.
So that's more like what determinism is. It's not as it's not like holding a gun to somebody's head, because you can still choose to just get shot. So when you put it that way, of somebody actually causally determining you to do something, this is the opposite of the God that we see in the pages of Scripture.
That's right. That's right. And I'm glad you brought up the manipulating of the mind to make us think that, to make somebody think that they want to kill that person. And that's why I spend so much time with the free thinking argument, talking about the importance of being a free thinker, that someone or something else, namely God in this situation, isn't always causally determining every one of my thoughts all the time. Surely God has created us with the supernatural ability, perhaps, to be free thinkers. And that's why I call it free thinking ministries. I think that's so important. But anyway, White misses the point and continues to miss the point, and then kind of lobs you a softball to crush, Tyson. So here's the softball. At 45:55, he says, "It does not make them puppets, because God will judge them." Isaiah chapter 10, for acting on the desires of their heart. Go ahead and crush it.
So why do they have those desires?
Boom.
Because God made them have those desires. So is White willing to be consistent and admit that? Does that seem just of God to make people have evil desires and then judge them for having those evil desires?
Well, White follows that at 46 minutes and says, so when you take biblical evidence as your foundation, then you can answer this. No dilemma.
Yeah, so this always sounds really pious, that this claim that one is just following the biblical evidence and arriving at determinism. But so far, what we've actually seen is that White unwittingly comes to the text presupposing determinism, and then reads it into various passages, rather than actually deriving such a philosophical view from the Bible. Okay,
Exactly.
He's not doing that. He's reading, he's not deriving his view from the Bible. He's reading that into the Bible.
Yeah. And yet he claims that that's what we're doing. Anyway, now White continues. And let me say this. To White's credit, he brought up the Avengers. So he gets points with me, which, by the way, provides an awesome illustration for God's middle knowledge with Dr. Strange. Dr. Strange basically used something quite similar to middle knowledge to defeat the evil of Thanos in Infinity War and Endgame. So highly recommend watching those movies. I've got a video on it here on this YouTube channel if you want to search for Doctor Strange. So take a look at that. But nevertheless, White says the following at 46:15. He says, the dilemma was created falsely by Tyson James by saying, quote, it's one of these two possibilities, only two possibilities, and neither one of them are biblical possibilities, end quote. There's no such thing as a determined puppet, he says, and there's no such thing as an autonomous pot. So the two horns of the dilemma disappeared as quickly as Thanos did. What do you think?
Well, I was going to say Thanos didn't disappear. He made half the population of the universe disappear, but then you pointed out he does disappear in Endgame. So
At the end,
yeah, Thanos disappears later. But second, there's really only two possibilities here, right? Either the plans of the people were causally necessitated by God, or they weren't. And that's the law of excluded middle. Yeah. Right. Note that White says it's a false dilemma, but he hasn't given a third option. That's what you do if you want to say that something is a false dilemma. You give another option. So to support his claim, he needs to provide another option, and so far he hasn't done that. So if the people were causally necessitated by God, then they were only the people's plans in the sense that God caused them to think they were their own plans. Right? They didn't make the plans at all. They had no causal input into their plans. Yeah. And third, again, by autonomous, White is assuming that free will implies ontological independence, which is a misrepresentation. We've already said that it doesn't have anything to do with ontological independence. Finally, puppets are determined. he keeps talking about puppets and determinism. Puppets are determined. They have no causal input into the effect desired by the puppeteer. On determinism, creatures have no causal input into the effect desired by the creator. So White and other determinists may not like the analogy, but it does seem to be accurate, logically speaking.
Yeah, it really does. And, Calvinists often get so angry that libertarians point out that according to their own view of EDD-Calvinism, that exhaustive divine determinism, that humans are relevantly analogous to puppets on strings. And they will often say, yeah, but something like this, that, well, but humans possess intentional states of consciousness and puppets don't. So there's a vital difference, and thus the comparison is not relevantly analogous. But really, that seems to miss the point. If Ed is true, which White wants to affirm, then God causally determines in some form or fashion exactly what humans think of and about, and more importantly, exactly how humans think of and about it. And this includes every incorrect thought. But on this Ed view, no human ever contributes to their set of beliefs, and no mental or physical action is ever ultimately up to them. Thus, if Ed is true, then God is ultimately a deity of deception, since no human, including James White, possesses infallible theology. But if EDD-Calvinism is true, then humans are nothing more than passive cogs, as John DePoe has recently written. Just passive cogs at the mercy of the whims of a deity of deception. None of our thoughts or actions are really up to us. All human thoughts and actions are ultimately up to, causally determined and necessitated by God. And this is why the comparison to puppets is completely justified. Well, let's move to 4840. And regarding libertarian freedom as a God-only property, he says, Yahweh spoke and it stood firm. You have never done that. Tyson James, you've never spoken and it stood firm. You cannot create ex nihilo, and neither can I. Go ahead, Tyson.
He's absolutely right. I've never created ex nihilo.
You haven't?
But again, note that White thinks. Say what?
I'm just shocked to hear you say that. I thought surely you've created something ex nihilo.
I know, it's crazy. So again, note that White thinks that libertarian freedom he thinks about it in terms of creation or decree, right? But libertarian freedom has nothing to do with creation or the creative decree. It has everything to do with the causal account of choosing. So since White doesn't understand what libertarian freedom is, he's attacking a completely different non-Molinist position.
Yep, exactly. All right, at 4950, he says there's nothing in the context to suggest it's a God-only property. And I say there is. God is the only autonomous will in creation because he's the only God in creation. Then it follows that God is able to create creatures which possess, again, I'm reading this from the...
He's quoting me,
yeah, okay, I think he's quoting... Yeah, so you were saying, then it follows that God is able to create creatures which possess libertarian freedom. And then he says, no, he creates creatures which possess creaturely freedom. Okay, go ahead.
yeah. Yeah, so this is the same thing. He's equating autonomous with ontologically independent, and that has nothing to do with Molinism. He just doesn't know what he's talking about. So this idea that libertarian freedom leads to ontological autonomy, it leads him to assume that that creaturely freedom precludes or prevents libertarian freedom by definition, even though the definition of libertarian freedom that we've given has nothing at all to do with ontological independence.
Yeah. All right, at 5120, White says, I respect Bill Craig's approach to this. He's at least coming out with it and saying there are these subjunctive conditionals that are true that delimit God's decree. That's different from saying, well, actually, the best proof of middle knowledge is that God has to be capable of making libertarianly free creatures, and therefore he must know, since he's omniscient, what they would do in any given circumstance. What do you think?
Well, first, Tim, neither you nor I have said that God's ability to create libertarianly free creatures is a proof of middle knowledge.
Right.
What we've said is that God has middle knowledge as a function or a correlate of having the ability to create free creatures.
Mm-hmm.
Right? The point is that unless there's something to suggest that libertarian free will is logically incoherent or that it's a God-only property, then there's no reason to think that God can't create free creatures. That's the only point. We're not saying that this is a proof.
Mm-hmm.
And then second, Dr. Craig does claim that God's ability to create free creatures is necessary for him to have middle knowledge. Like for many years, he's contended that God's omnipotence includes the ability to create free creatures, and that if there are truths about what those creatures would freely do in various circumstances, then God must know them prior to the decree. Why is that? Because if God determines the truth values of these subjunctive conditionals, what they would do, only via the decree or after the decree, then this would obliterate creaturely freedom altogether. So really our position is exactly the same as Dr. Craig's, right? God's middle knowledge is a function of his ability to create free creatures. White has not shown that God cannot create free creatures, and therefore he hasn't shown that God can't know prior to the decree what free creatures would do in any given circumstance, which is middle knowledge. Mm-hmm. So what the passage says, it says, for he spoke and it came to be. He commanded and it stood firm. Right? That's what it says. To take that passage and say, this is teaching that God cannot create free creatures is to completely abandon the pretense of doing serious hermeneutics. It's just not there.
Right. And again, Dr. James White has a ministry seemingly based upon his ability to properly engage in biblical hermeneutics. But like I said before, he's really shooting himself and his entire ministry in the foot by making so many bad mistakes here. Look, the last thing we want to see happen is for Dr. White to tarnish his ministry or his trustworthiness. But he's giving everybody good reason to be suspicious of all of his teachings because he's handling this particular issue so poorly. And with that, White continues with a modal error at 5212 and says, if they have libertarian freedom, then how can it be known what they would do in any given circumstance? Because if it is known, then they're not free. What do you think, Tyson?
Boy, haven't we heard this 100,000 times? um, yeah, here White makes another really elementary error by assuming that God's knowledge is causal, right? Merely knowing an event in advance is not the same as causing it to happen. So I like to use my wife as an example. If I set sushi and chicken in front of my wife, I know that she's going to choose the sushi, but my setting those things in front of her doesn't cause her to choose either one, right? The idea that knowledge precludes freedom is yet another philosophical assumption that White brings to the text, and that's not found in Scripture. You certainly cannot find this idea in Psalm 33 that just because God knows something in advance, that therefore he causally determines it.
Yeah, this has been discussed at length. Simply knowing what your wife will choose does not magically, causally determine her to choose the sushi. That choice is still genuinely up to her. You simply knew how she would freely choose. There's no magic involved. All right, at 5228, White says, if you then place them in that situation knowing what they're going to do you not share part of the responsibility of so doing?
Yeah. So let's read that again. He said, if you then place them, he's talking about Molinism here. If you then place them in that situation, knowing what they're going to do you not share part of the responsibility in so doing? Okay. He definitely did not think this statement through, since if it undermines the Molinist position, then it also undermines his own position, right? He says that on Molinism, if God places people in the situation knowing what they're going to do, then he shares responsibility for what they do. But this is exactly what happens on determinism. So whatever reason he gives for saying that God is not responsible for the creature's act, that reason will work equally well for the Molinist.
Yeah.
By contrast, Molinism gives a much better explanation for how God is not responsible for evil choices, since God's knowing a creature's choices in advance does not cause them to choose that way.
Well said. Now, White continues and suggests that our flavor of Molinism is different than Dr. Craig's, or perhaps he's implying that you and I, Tyson, don't understand Dr. Craig as well as James White does. And he says at 5340, he says, you're always talking about the attributes of God, which means you end up, and this is frightening, making middle knowledge one of the attributes of God. That's not what Craig says. He doesn't say it's an attribute of God. Well, what do you think, Tyson? Is that true?
Well, actually, here's what Dr. Craig says in Defenders, Series 1, Doctrine of God, Part 8. Quote, it is sort of like asking how God can be omnipotent. Well, I don't know how he can be omnipotent either. How can God have the ability to do everything that is logically possible for him to do? I don't know. Or how can God be holy? I don't know how to answer those kinds of questions with respect to God. It seems to me these are just essential attributes of God. Listen to this. Now, in exactly the same way, it seems to me that if there are truths about how people would freely behave under various circumstances, then as an omniscient being, God simply would have to know these things as an essential property of his, because he knows only and all truths. So I think the real question here is not how does God know these things, but are there truths of this nature? Once you admit that there are truths of this nature, then I think you have got to say God knows them if he is omniscient. End quote. So right there, Defenders Series 1, Doctrine of God, Part 8, Dr. Craig affirms that middle knowledge is an essential property of God. And there's really nothing wrong with saying that it's part of his essential attribute of omniscience, right?
Right.
I think it's often said that we fear the unknown. And in this case, I think it's White who is fearing the unknown. He simply fears Molinism because he can't understand it. He said on his show that he spent more time studying Molinism leading up to the dialogue and probably a little bit after than he has in his entire life. Okay, so I thought about this a little bit. I said, let's say that he spent 4 months studying Molinism, going up to the dialogue, and then a little bit afterwards to respond to people like you and me. He said that that's more than he's ever studied in his life. So let's just double that number. 4 months doubles that to get the entire amount of time that he spent studying Molinism in his entire life. That gets up to 8 months. Okay, that's 8 months of studying Molinism. Tim, you and I have been studying this topic for years, right? Dr. Craig spent 7 years studying the topic of divine omniscience. And out of that, he wrote his book, was it Divine Foreknowledge and Human Freedom? And, for Dr. Craig, 7 years of study is like 50 years to us mere mortals, right? The man is a machine. So, Dr. Craig has spent a lot of time studying this. You and I have spent a lot of time studying this. I don't think White has spent enough time for him to really be familiar enough with this to make cogent arguments. And I think that's why he fears it. It undermines some of his positions and would require some radical shifting in his thinking if he was to address it seriously for an extended period of time.
Well, I'm thinking about all the time that you and I have spent studying this. And Tyson, you and I have known each other for quite a few years now. And this was an issue that kind of brought us together as friends. But we were both studying it even before we met each other. And, I started studying Molinism in an attempt to refute it. That was my goal. Look, at the time, I was still a cage stage Calvinist, willing to go to war with anybody to tell them that Calvinism was true and just to destroy their position. I fought with my wife over this. So if I was willing to fight with my wife and sleep on the couch because of this, because of my passion for Calvinism, of course I would fight with anybody. But look, in an attempt to refute this, starting in 2010, after about, I think I studied it almost every day, hoping to destroy it. Back in 2010, after a year of study, I realized all the problems with EDD-Calvinism, the view that I was holding. And so I soon became a Molinist after that. And I've been studying it daily for nearly a dozen years. And look, at this point, I've realized, wow, I still have a lot to learn. And I have a PhD.
You're basically like the Lee Strobel of Molinism, right? He started out, studying Christianity because he thought it was wrong, and he was like, "Oh, I'm just gonna do a little bit of research and I'm gonna show that it's wrong." It's the exact same thing.
I've never been called the Lee Strobel of Molinism before, but that's pretty funny. Maybe they'll make a movie about me. I don't know.
Yeah.
That's hilarious. Well, look, I know that I still have a lot to learn. I'm just getting started. It's like after I got my black belt in karate back in the day. I'll never forget. My instructor put that black belt around my waist and tied it up for me in front of the whole class. And then he told me that I was finally ready to start learning karate after I got my black belt. And with that karate black belt analogy in mind, when it comes to Molinism, James White is still a white belt. And so I encourage him to keep studying these topics. Well, with that said, let's go to 54:26. And he's quoting a Molinist here. It says, and if God can create such creatures, then he must know prior to the to the creative decree what each such creature would freely do in any freedom permitting circumstance. And then White says, I say that's irrational. It's illogical because the decisions of free creatures are dependent upon their created nature. which comes from the decree. You cannot have a creature before the decree to form the creature in the way that allows him to make decisions. What do you think, Tyson?
Oh, that was a lot of assertions.
Yeah.
So claiming that something is irrational or illogical is not the same as demonstrating it, right? Merely asserting your own view doesn't really do anything to show that a different view is wrong. So White here is just asserting that God cannot create libertarianly free creatures or know what they would freely do were he to create them in particular circumstances. But he's not given any good reason, biblical or otherwise, to think that's the case. So what if, as White claims, the decisions of free creatures are dependent upon their created natures, right? So what? Does God not know prior to the decree that he can create Peter and his particular nature in first century Palestine? And if he knows that he can create Peter and his particular nature prior to the decree, then what prevents him from knowing what Peter would do were he to actually decide to create him in first century Palestine with his particular nature?
Yeah. All right. 54-55. He says, you tell me where scripture tells you that mankind makes decisions separate from the influences of God upon his life in his relationship to Adam in his fallen state, and how he's created and how he's going to interact with the creatures around him. These are all part of God's decree. What do you think?
Yeah, so let's take what White has said here and ask if this is the Molinist position. He says that according to Molinism, mankind creates, or he says that mankind makes decisions separate from the influences of God upon his life. Does the Molinist make that claim? Of course not.
Yeah.
The content of middle knowledge does not include the actual decisions that mankind makes. It includes the decisions they would make were God to create them. Actual decisions are part of God's free knowledge. Subjunctive conditional decisions are part of God's middle knowledge and do not require the existence of creatures. So again, White is demonstrating that he just doesn't understand the very basics of Molinism.
Yeah. All right. So around the 50, go ahead and read to us what White says at the 5740 mark and tell us what you think about that.
Yeah. So this was a funny little tidbit. He quotes me. He says, from my article, I say the final sentence is in White's previous statement is strange. White seems to think that God's ability to incorporate the free choices of every free creature into his providential plan, in White's terms, his ability to actuate, and then in brackets, I put SIC, his ability to actuate a world. And then White pauses and he's like really confused. And he says, he puts SIC after actuate. This is a transcript. I didn't misspell anything. And actuating a world, that's common Molinistic terminology. So I don't even know why it's put in there. Okay. So I just wanted to clarify why I put SIC there. Seek, it means thus, or, that's the way that it was presented or written or said or whatever in the original. So he said, actuating a world is common Molinistic terminology. Okay, so what you can do is go onto your web browser and type, in quotations, actuate or actuating, and then space, cite, reasonablefaith.org. And you can search the entire Reasonable Faith website for those terms. You will find that Dr. Craig has never used the term actuate or actuating a world. It's actualizing a world. And so there's a difference there. To actuate is to cause to operate. To actualize is to bring into reality.
Yeah.
And the reason that I wrote that little note in there was because sometimes it's those subtle differences in wording that indicate whether or not someone has really studied a topic. Yeah. If you're studying the topic all the time, then you learn the vocabulary. You're not making those little errors in common terms, right? Actualizing a world, that's part and parcel of what we talk about all the time. So it's just those subtle little things that I like to point out to, you know, kind of the gateway. It's like, you know, does this person really know what they're talking about? Well, let's see if they use the terminology correctly.
Right. All right. Well, then he goes and he quotes you at 5807 and says his ability to actuate. Well, I don't think he's attributing this to you, or maybe you'll have to help me out here, but it says his ability to actuate a world is a limitation, and followed by saying, yes, it's a limitation. He does not get to freely choose the world. There are worlds that are not feasible to him because of the content of mental knowledge. All right, help me out there.
Yeah. So so when he says his ability to actuate a world is a limitation, that was me quoting White.
Okay, got it.
Yeah, so that's actually him in the original broadcast.
Okay.
So anyway, he says, yeah, it's a limitation. He does not get to freely choose the world. There are worlds that are not feasible to God because of the content of mental knowledge. So again, this is like saying that it's a limitation on God, that he can't create a world in which he doesn't exist, or in which there are no married bachelors, or 2 + 2 = 5. It's not properly a limitation at all, right? To say that God cannot do the logically impossible. Rather, full, unlimited omnipotence entails the ability to do that which is logically possible.
Mm-hmm.
Likewise, full, unlimited omniscience entails the knowledge of what free creatures would freely do in a given circumstance prior to the decree. So unless White can show that a libertarianly free creature is logically incoherent, then it's actually him that is placing an unjustified limitation on the power and knowledge of God, not Molinists.
Talk about the pot calling the kettle, whatever. Anyway, White continued at 59:15 and said, the only way we can love God is if he changes our hearts. That doesn't fit into a philosophical syllogism. Is that true?
Actually, it does fit into a logical syllogism. You can put just about anything into a logical syllogism. So here's a logical syllogism. Number one, premise one, if God doesn't change our hearts, then we cannot love him. Premise two, we can love him. Premise three, therefore God changes our hearts.
There you go.
This is a valid deductive syllogism of the form modus tollens, and it's perhaps even a sound one. So, but what follows from the conclusion?
Yeah.
All that really follows is that God changes our hearts. It doesn't necessarily follow, though, that the way he changes our hearts is via exhaustive divine causal determinism. So the question is causal determinism necessary for changing our hearts? And I don't think so. And I've given this analogy in a prior video, and a lot of people said they really like this analogy. So I'm going to give it again. So I don't think that causal determinism is necessary for me to change my 6-year-old daughter from a non-bike rider to a bike rider. If my daughter is too scared of falling, I need to encourage her to be brave. If her legs are too weak to push the pedals, I need to get her more exercise to build her strength. If my daughter is too scared of falling, or if she's about to fall off, I need to be there to catch her so that she can continue practicing. And then one day, after all of that, she will be able to ride the bike. And I will have turned her from a non-bike riding person into a bike riding person.
Yeah.
But it wouldn't have been a deterministic process where I just zap her and poof, she's riding a bike. Rather, it was a process of guiding and correcting with love and patience. Does that remind you of anything?
Yeah.
How about 2 Peter chapter 3, verse 9? The Lord is not slow to fulfill his promises, as some count slowness, but is patient toward you, not wishing that any should perish, but that all should reach repentance.
That's beautiful. And yeah, I told you this before, Tyson. I absolutely love the image of you, of a loving father teaching your daughter how to ride a bike, changing her nature from a non-bike rider to that of a little girl possessing a bike riding nature, and you being patient with her and loving her along the way and encouraging her. But yeah, that doesn't mean you're causally determining her. It's just a really good analogy or illustration. Yeah, and you don't violate her libertarian freedom in the process. All right, well, let's go to 5936. This is kind of a long quote here. He says, consider Dr. William Lane Craig's description of a possible world.
Yeah, just to note that he's quoting me at the beginning here.
Okay, so here's a quote. By a possible world, one doesn't mean a planet or even a universe, but rather a complete description of reality, or a way reality might be. I think the exact opposite of White's claim is true. God's ability to incorporate free choices into his selection of a complete description of reality is an indication of his perfect power and knowledge. Which is more powerful, a being which can incorporate free choices into his exhaustive providential planning, or one who cannot? Again, see how far out of Psalm 33 we've gone. See how far out of the exhaustive creation that is described in Psalm 33 we've gone. And so now the argument is, quote, well, I just think it makes God really big. Is this Dr. White saying this part here?
Yeah.
Okay, so here's White. He's saying, well, I just think it makes God really big that he can take this stuff and that we cannot ground, we cannot explain where it comes from. And sometimes we say it's part of God's nature, and sometimes we say it's an attribute, and sometimes we say whatever. He can take all that stuff, and he can bring that in. That makes him greater than a God that just forces people to do stuff. Where's the problem there? It forces people to do stuff. There's just simply a straw man argument. Jesus was a true man. Was he a puppet? Was he forced to do certain things? Did God have middle knowledge of what the God-man Jesus Christ would do based upon middle knowledge? These are big questions that betray the shallowness of the categories of the Molinistic apologist in making his argumentation. Go ahead, Tyson.
All right. So there are a few different things going on there, and that was a really long passage. So let me break it down a little bit. So first we see White denigrating perfect being theology, which is the idea that God just is the maximally great being, so that any concept which is less than maximally great is disqualified from being God. This is actually really effective, especially against Islam. So Islam posits a concept of God, which is not essentially loving.
Right.
In Islam, God's love is conditional and dependent on our first achieving a certain level of righteousness before God loves us. And you can read that in the Quran. So far, the only response White has given is that perfect being theology is not biblical. I would argue the opposite. The very concept of God in the Bible, the entire witness of the Bible, is that God is a perfect being. That's just presupposed by the authors of Scripture. And that's why the writer of Hebrews is able to say it's impossible for God to lie, or why James calls God the Father of lights, with whom there is no variation or shadow due to change, or why Jesus himself says, therefore, you must be perfect as your heavenly Father is perfect.
Yeah.
So since God just is the one and only perfect being, we can conclude that any concept of God which is less than perfect is not accurate. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that White claims that saying determinism is the same as forcing people to do stuff is a straw man. He's the one saying that our claim that determinism is forcing people to do stuff, he says that's a straw man. But is it? Well, to me, it just seems to follow by definition, right? On determinism, God is literally causing people to will, to choose, and to do everything.
Yeah.
How is that not the same as forcing them to will and to choose and to do? I mean, he can claim they're different all he wants, but it it is what his view implies.
Mm-hmm.
So if he wants to give a different account, then he's more than welcome to clarify how those are different. And then the third thing is he again brings up Jesus as the God-man and then asks whether or not God has middle knowledge of what Jesus would do. And as I mentioned in our last video, which I don't think White has seen, or if he has, he didn't catch this part, but this issue was answered by Dr. Craig in a Question of the Week article, number 223, actually, on the website, if you want to look it up. Middle knowledge includes knowledge of creaturely free choices, not God's free choices. Jesus is God. He's not a creature. So middle knowledge does not include his free choices. His free choices were made at the divine creative decree. So again, because White hasn't studied this subject very much, he doesn't understand why middle knowledge doesn't apply to God's choices, or that one cannot have middle knowledge of one's own choices, because otherwise it would destroy libertarian freedom. So, White claims that his questions betray the shallowness of Molinism, but I think what we've seen is all it really does is show that Molinists, in fact, have addressed all of these issues, and that White is completely unfamiliar with even the free literature that's available.
Yeah. All right. So I think that pretty much sums up your response to the first video that White did. But then White did a second video addressing you. So let's transition now to that video. And at the 4-minute, the 4:30 mark, so 4-minute and 30-second mark, he says there is a clear contrast between the plans of men and the plans of God, that God frustrates the plans of men. These are plans that they have hatched in their hearts. Of course, that means these are unregenerate men. These are unregenerate kings or generals, whoever it might be. We're talking primarily about the nations outside of Israel. And so these are the fallen sons and daughters of Adam. Go ahead.
Yeah, on White's determinism, what does it even mean that these are plans that they have hatched in their hearts?
Yeah.
What exactly does that mean? It means that factors on determinism, it means that factors completely outside of the people themselves causally necessitated them to make these plans. So in other words, they were forced to make these plans by God. Yeah. Notice that White wants to avoid saying God somehow shares responsibility in the people's evil plans. And so he uses this language that places the activity, this hatching, in the people's hearts. But on determinism, the only reason they have these hearts to begin with, that hatch evil plans, is because God created them with evil hearts.
Right.
Right? On determinism, to say that God frustrates the plans of the people is logically equivalent to saying God causally necessitated the evil plans of the people and then frustrated those evil plans that were forced on them by factors completely outside of them.
Right.
Right. I really think for anyone whose understanding of morality is informed by the Bible, this view will immediately raise red flags.
Right. Yeah. It's like that mad scientist and giant robot causally determined to destroy the city again. Yeah, red flags. And I think, unless somebody is already committed to this position for some reason, I don't see why anybody would affirm it. But anyway, White continues at the 5-minute and 10-second mark and says, one of the things that needs to have more discussion is one of the gaping holes in Molinism is its anthropology. Since it's philosophically derived, it's primarily attractive to people who just want to do little logical games and philosophical quandaries and things like that. It completely lacks any kind of meaningful anthropology, because to even say that God has knowledge of what any given person will do before that person is decreed to be made raises all sorts of real problems in regards to the doctrine of total depravity, original sin, the inability of man to do that which is pleasing to God, And so it doesn't matter what circumstance someone is put in. If you're spiritually dead, there is a limitation by your nature on the range of options that are available to you. That's a given. Wow. There's a lot I want to say about that, but go ahead, Tyson.
All right. Well, notice how White is using belittling and condescending language to suggest that Molinists are just nerds who don't really care about things of practical import, right? We're just, in our little basements working on little philosophical and logical puzzles, and we're totally disconnected from the real world where real theology is happening, right? No, we're talking about upholding the perfect righteousness of God and the responsibility of man for his sin. We're talking about demonstrating how the God revealed in nature and scripture can be rightfully said to be holy. And White thinks that we're just playing logical games and solving little philosophical quandaries, right? People's faith has been shipwrecked by the inconsistency that exists between White's determinism that's shared by many pastors around the world, and the love and moral perfection of the God revealed in the Bible.
Mm-hmm.
And I truly pity people who struggle under the mental strain caused by this cognitive dissonance that's needed to maintain that God moves his creatures to choose and do evil, and that somehow God is not the author of evil.
Yeah.
Right? And that the benefits of Molinism here, I think, are just as much pastoral as they are intellectual.
That's so true.
So another thing, going back to what he said here regarding anthropology, note that on White, man's inability to please God,
Let me stop you. Go back to the beginning of that point that you're making.
Yeah. Okay. So regarding anthropology, on White's determinism, everything, total depravity, original sin, man's inability to please God, spiritual death, all of these are causally necessitated by God himself. Mm-hmm. And man has absolutely no control over the factors that make him choose what he chooses and does what he does. So White is correct that on determinism, it really doesn't matter what circumstances one is put in, because no matter what the circumstances are, they're not freedom permitting. And God is the one causing people to sin, right? Which is a really weird anthropology. Mm-hmm. Like, don't you want to say that people actually have an input into their moral choices? Yeah. So anyway, White is correct that there is a limitation by our nature on the range of options available. But so what? Yeah. Libertarian free will, it works just as well if there are two evil options, as it does if there are an option between good and evil. Mm-hmm. That's because it's a causal account of how choices are made, not an account of how many choices are available to us. Yeah. So clearly White has not studied these issues enough to even know the difference.
That's right. Yeah, that's why I discuss in my book limited libertarian freedom. As long as it's limited to at least two choices, each of which are compatible with the creature's nature in a circumstance where the antecedent conditions are insufficient to necessitate one's choice or to causally determine one's choice. And you've got libertarian freedom. Again, 1 Corinthians 10:13 shows that at least Christians have this. And then just regarding the unregenerate, we can ask, does the unregenerate sinner possess the opportunity to exercise an ability to choose between a range of options between robbing the bank or robbing the liquor store? Or does God causally determine exactly that they rob the bank? Well, that's going to get us back into the original problem that Craig and White were supposed to discuss in the first place and get us into the problem of evil. So anyway, let's move to 635. And White says, and then, of course, so many of our decisions are based upon not just a sterile set of circumstances, but upon interaction with other fallen, sinful human beings. Take it away.
Yeah, again, does White really think that the circumstances of a counterfactual of creaturely freedom doesn't also include the entire history of the universe? including other counterfactuals of the free choices of other creatures? I mean, haven't we been saying the whole time that via his middle knowledge, God can incorporate all of our free choices into his providential planning of history? Does he really think that when Molinists read about the circumstances of Peter's freely denying Christ, they don't also know that this circumstance includes the Romans freely arresting Jesus first, or the other people in the courtyard freely accusing Peter of being associated with them? It includes all of that. So I don't understand where he's getting this idea that the circumstances don't include interaction with other free creatures. And it's actually White's determinism that makes the circumstances sterile, right? Since the characters in the story have no control over what they're saying or doing, right? It all collapses into God causally necessitating everything. So they're not really interacting with each other, but only in the sense that God is causing them to do and act and think as they do. And then I noted before that the Bible actually supports the Molinist view, right? It teaches us that the circumstances are really significant to whether a person comes to God or not. I think we mentioned this in a couple of videos now. Acts chapter 17, verses 26 to 27. It says, "And he made from one man every nation of mankind to live on all of the face of the earth, having determined allotted periods and the boundaries of their dwelling place, that they should seek God and perhaps feel their way toward him and find him." So circumstances are really important to people seeking God and finding him. On determinism, the circumstances have absolutely nothing to do with a person coming to God. God can simply causally determine them to come to him at any time and in any situation. And again, the Bible makes much more sense on Molinism than on White's determinism here.
Yeah. And again, as Molinists, we're not saying that God doesn't determine anything. I mean, here in Acts, he determined the allotted periods and their boundaries of their dwelling place. But who is dwelling here? Well, it seems to be creatures with libertarian freedom. And I think this is even implied in this text when it says, perhaps feel their way toward him and find him. I don't think the language here is trying to be philosophically precise, but I think it's kind of at least implied here. We're saying that, God determined some things, but this seems to work quite nicely. He determined the circumstances in which libertarian free creatures exist and choose and live. So anyway, then White goes on and makes some really odd claims. At 650, he says that sinful nature is not a predictable nature. Sinful natures are tremendously unpredictable. And we have biblical evidence that God is engaged in restraining the evil of men. I'm confused. What do you think?
Yeah, what he just said makes absolutely no sense. Well, first of all, if sinful natures are not predictable natures, then God cannot predict them.
Yeah.
It's
right.
That's what it means to not be predictable. So obviously they are predictable because he wants to say that God knows, right? So that's just wrong. He also wants to use this language of restraining the evil of men. But according to White, it's not possible for creatures to have free will. He's already said that. So the only possibility is for creatures to do exactly what they're caused to do. So again, what exactly is God restraining? The greater evil that God could make them do? How exactly is that restraining in any meaningful sense? This is just doublespeak. And definitely not anything borne out by Psalm 33 or really any other passage of Scripture.
Right. All right, moving to 705, he says, there can be no room, as far as I can see in Molinism, for an active providence of God in restraining the actions of men. That would be a violation of their quote-unquote free will. That would be the married bachelor or the square with three sides.
Where is it? Okay, I've got something.
The reverse card.
This is where we play the Uno reverse card.
Nice.
So On Molinism, there is a true counterfactual about what evil men would freely do were God to not restrain them. So there is a truth to that. So it makes sense to say that by interfering, God is really stopping men from doing what they would freely do were he not to interfere. Molinism doesn't claim that God can't interfere with our free choices. What it does claim is that God can make creatures capable of free choices and knows what those free choices would be were he to put those creatures in particular circumstances. On determinism, God isn't restraining creatures. He's restraining himself from making those creatures do things.
Right.
And this is exactly why I think Psalm 33 cannot be used as a proof text against libertarian free will. It makes an absolute mockery of the idea that both man and God genuinely make plans.
Right. That's right. Well, White asks a deep question that he apparently thinks the Molinist can't answer. So get ready for this one. At the 8-minute mark, he says, how many times did Joseph walk past a Roman soldier? How many times did Mary walk past a Roman soldier before the angelic announcement? And could not one of those Roman soldiers have given vent to their evil?
Could not have one of those soldiers given vent to their evil? Well, on determinism, no.
Yeah.
Right? Unless God caused them to do so. They couldn't have done anything.
Right.
But on Molinism, God doesn't need to cause them to do anything because he knew that in all of those circumstances in which Joseph and Mary passed by those Roman soldiers, they would not have given vent to their evil, even though they could have. So by God's providentially bringing about those circumstances, he guarantees, though he doesn't causally determine, that Joseph and Mary would pass by unharmed.
Yeah.
Notice also that at this point, White is talking about Roman soldiers and Joseph and Mary. He's strayed quite a long way at this point from attempting to show that Psalm 33 is a proof text against libertarian free will.
Yeah, quite a long way indeed. Well, he continues in his journey at 9:23, and he says, remember, Molina believed in prevenient grace. So he's a Roman Catholic. Prevenient grace is the cellophane tape of theology. It's just there to hold stuff together, but it never actually works. There's just no biblical basis. Look, Tyson, I don't know about you, but I'm not Catholic. I was a Protestant pastor for years and still belong to the Evangelical Free Church of America. Are you Catholic? And is Dr. Craig Catholic? Help us out.
No, I'm not Catholic. And as explained by Dr. Craig, who is also not a Roman Catholic, he's actually a member of a Baptist church in Georgia. As explained by him, prevenient grace is God's seeking out sinful, alienated, spiritually estranged people and drawing them to himself to the point where one can respond or not by faith. That's what's meant by prevenient grace.
Yeah.
So the question is, White says there's just no biblical basis. Well, what about John 6:44? No one can come to me unless the Father who sent me draws him. Right? It's this drawing which Molina and others considered God's prevenient grace.
Right.
So it's prevenient in the sense that it comes before one's faith. This drawing comes before one's faith. That's literally what prevenient means. It means to come before.
Yeah.
And it's grace because it's unmerited. Right? God draws us all to himself because he loves all of us, not because we've earned his favor.
Amen.
Right? So I think it is biblical. Again, and this seems to be exactly what's going on in Acts chapter 17, verses 26 to 27, again, where God places people in particular circumstances so that they would seek him and find him. Right? That makes sense on Molinism. That's a grace that God would put you in that position because the circumstances are really important to whether or not a person freely comes to Christ. On determinism, the circumstances make no difference. And God can just zap people with salvation at any point. So if anything, what the Bible is actually saying is that God's grace places people in situations that are favorable to them coming to him, rather than just causally determining some people to salvation and other people to eternal damnation.
All right, at 9:55, White says, Molina's depending upon something that is not at all biblical to make it even a possibility that God could put people into a position where they will freely choose to follow Christ. There is no such position. According to Romans chapter 8, there is no condition you can put someone in where they will freely do that, because unless they have been regenerated, they will not do that which is pleasing to God. They will not submit themselves to the law of God. How would you respond, Tyson James?
Yeah, so again, because White doesn't even know what we mean by libertarian free will, he's really unqualified to say whether Romans 8 has anything to do with it. But let's just give it to him for the sake of argument. Let's say that no one will submit themselves to the law of God unless they have first been regenerated. So once they're regenerated, are they able to freely submit themselves to the law of God or not? Well, 1 Corinthians 10:13 says that regenerate Christians have the option to choose between resisting and giving into temptation.
Yeah.
So this seems sufficient for libertarian freedom,
Mhm.
because the alternative is causal determinism, where one's choice is limited to that which is causally necessitated by factors outside of one's control. So that would remove a genuine option from 1 Corinthians 10:13.
Yeah.
So yet again, we do not see the exclusion of libertarian free will in Romans 8. Yet again, we see White's use of proof texts far exceeding what's actually contained in the texts themselves. The Molinist anthropology, then, it turns out to be much more biblical than White's exhaustive divine causal determinism.
Yeah. Amen to that. In fact, let me do it again. Shameless plug. I discuss 1 Corinthians 10:13 and provide an argument based upon this biblical passage in my new book, The Mere Molinism Study Guide. Again, see the link in the description. All right. White says at the 11-minute mark, by the way, I'm really tired of them, talking about you and I, Tyson. By the way, I'm really tired of them saying that I somehow reject logic, as if I've ever said that. Logic is only as good as the basis upon which it proceeds. Go ahead.
Tim, have you said that White rejects logic? I know I haven't.
I don't recall doing such a thing.
Yeah,
I
I've
think I've
never, I
said
don't
that he's
think
been
we've ever,
dismissive of syllogisms and things like that, but I think that's as far as I've gone.
yeah, I don't think we've ever once claimed that White rejects logic. He does seem to disparage philosophy,
Mm-hmm.
of which logic is an essential component. But be that as it may, what we said is that White's view of logic is fatally flawed.
Mm-hmm.
So as we've noted multiple times, White affirms something called universal possibilism, which is the idea that that because God literally creates all truths, there simply are no laws of logic until God creates them, which we take to be absurd.
Mm-hmm.
Why do we take it to be absurd? Because in order for God to create anything, it cannot be true that he both exists and doesn't exist in order to create them. Right? If he didn't exist, then he could not create the laws of logic. But to say that it's true that God exists in order to create the laws of logic, it would already have to be true that God exists, which means there's a truth that God did not create, namely that God exists. So it's not that White rejects logic, it's that his view of logic implies incoherence.
Right.
Right. So note also that just because God's existence is necessary for the truth of anything, otherwise there would be no reality, right? That doesn't mean that the non-theist can't effectively use the laws of logic, right? At most, they just wouldn't be able to account for why the laws of logic are necessarily true. But if the atheist can show via the laws of logic that something is logically incoherent, like, for example, White's philosophical assumptions, then it's just as valid as if a Christian does it. And that's because the validity of the laws of logic don't change according to the beliefs of the person using them.
Right.
So I would just suggest for more on this, you can check out a debate that my buddy Eric Hernandez did with Cy Ten Bruggencate on classical versus presuppositional apologetics on the Sin Boldly radio show.
And as William Lane Craig once said, that guy's exactly right. Hernandez.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think
I'm
that
sure
was
he's still on cloud nine because of that comment.
yeah. Eric Hernandez is just an awesome guy, a great friend to both of us, and a fantastic thinker, really making some waves for God's glory in Texas. So anyway, White said at the 1340 mark, within Molinism, God is limited to feasible worlds based upon not something that flows from his eudokia, does not flow from his will, but is something, his true subjunctive conditionals that he does not create, that he has no control over and cannot change.
Yeah, so because White doesn't understand that feasible worlds don't place a non-logical limitation on God, he thinks that simply any subjunctive conditionals one can dream up should be feasible for God.
Hmm.
So he hasn't really interacted at all with the difference between possible and feasible worlds. I don't think he understands the difference. And because he doesn't understand the difference, he says things like the subjunctive conditionals don't flow from God's eudokia. And then he thinks he's said something profound.
Yeah.
But all he's really showing is that he has no idea what the logical entailments of his radical philosophical views, like universal possibilism, truth maker maximalism, exhaustive divine causal determinism. He doesn't understand what those entail. There are truths which God does not create. Okay, God does not create the truth that God exists. God does not create the truth that God is triune. God does not create the truth that God cannot create another God, or that 2 + 2 = 4,
Right.
or that A equals A, the law of identity. Right? These things are all true pre-volitionally. All right, and it's also true pre-volitionally or pre-eudokia that God can create free creatures and that he knows what those creatures would freely do in a given circumstance. And then he goes on to quote, he cites the quote from Jonathan Thompson, who's a very intelligent friend, and Jonathan here is talking about White's incoherence. And I'm not going to quote all of that, but just to note that White is talking about this claim. And White claims that Jonathan, our friend, doesn't understand the issue or Dr. Craig's work. And so I just wanted to bring up the fact that, Jonathan is actually the one that created the Molinism official Facebook group back in 2017. And he was studying Molinism way before that. And he also attends Dr. Craig's church, and he's vastly more familiar with Dr. Craig's work than White is. So to say that he doesn't understand this issue is laughable because
it really is
way more than White has. Yeah.
Yeah, John has written multiple articles for Free Thinking Ministries and attends Dr. Craig's Defenders Sunday School class. I mean, he learns directly from Dr. Craig every weekend. So anyway, Tyson, tell us about the next segment from White's video that you'd like to address. Go ahead and kind of go through that.
So at the 17-minute, 15-second mark, he goes on to read a part in my article where I quote him talking about God fashioning the heart of man. He's also talking about my critique that White illicitly assumes that God's fashioning the heart of man entails that all of man's choices are causally determined. In the article, I said, here, White's exegesis far exceeds the biblical data. Yes, God fashions the heart of man. Does he fashion it to provide us with free will or not? This text does not give us any indication. So that's what I said. So White goes on to say, now remember, this is the text that has already had God as creator of all things. Everyone is to be in awe of him. Man's plans and counsels are frustrated, God's are not. But the text has no indication that when God says he looks down on the sons of men, and he who fashions their hearts understands their actions completely. No, it has nothing to do with the nature of the will, right? So he's saying this very sarcastically.
Yeah.
So again, White doesn't even understand what we mean by free will. So he's not even able to say whether or not the text says anything against it. We all agree that God is the creator of all things. Everyone is to be in awe of him. Man's plans and counsels are frustrated and God's are not. Right? We all agree with that. But
Hmm.
none of this speaks to the causal account of choosing, which is the heart of the issue. And then, White tries to posture as if simply reading what I've said is sufficient to refute it. But of course, as I've shown in detail, I think over the past 2 hours and 15 minutes almost, um, you know, uh, it seems like he's completely oblivious to the fact that he's bringing a variety of non-biblical philosophical assumptions and then reading them into the text,
Yes.
right? Instead of
Mhm.
getting them out of it. So, of course, what I've written in the article is going to be very objectionable to him. And that's because he's reading his philosophical views into the Bible and then claiming that the Bible precludes libertarian freedom when it
Yeah,
actually doesn't.
right. All right. Well, finally, we get to talk about the essence of James White again, and because you can't get enough of the essence of James White.
Sold out
But
in stores everywhere.
that's right. If I were rich, I would wear the essence of James White. I think Peter Byram made a fantastic video, uh, and it's got Dr. Craig saying that if I were rich, I would wear the essence of James White. Oh man. Okay. Well, at 2030, he says the essence of James White stuff. There is no essence of a human being floating around out there that can be known as to what the human being will do without addressing the issues of the heart. Yes, who formed the heart and what does forming mean? That's a part of the decree. So, once again, that which is allegedly known in middle knowledge has to be from the decree of God. You can't separate them biblically. Take it away, Tyson.
Yeah, well, first, again, Molinism is not married to essentialism, right? I've said this
Mhm.
before. Dr. Craig is not an essentialist. He's an anti-realist regarding essences. And I didn't say anything at all about essences in my article, so I don't know why
Mhm.
he's bringing it up here. That's really just a straw man.
Right.
Second, note that he didn't at all address the fact that I showed that the Bible uses the heart as a synonym for the person himself. So he
Mhm.
basically just said, here are some Bible verses, gave Genesis 6:5, and noted there that it says the thoughts of the heart, right? The thoughts of the heart. So if the heart is not synonymous with the person, then the heart is something which has thoughts distinct from the thoughts of the person.
Hmm.
So White earlier mentioned anthropology, and I think this is a very, very strange view of anthropology. Do you really want to say that there's components of us which are separate from our persons, which have thoughts?
Yeah.
Are we not the ones that are actually thinking those thoughts? I don't think you
Oh,
want to say that. So
no.
no, I think it's very clear that heart is just synonymous for the inner or true self, the
Yeah.
hidden self that is of the mind.
Well, I've got a lot I would want to say on that too, but my wife just called me, so and I had to hit, hey, I'll call you back later. So we'll speed it up here.
All right, we'll go quickly. Here we go.
All right, all right. 2102. On Molinism, he says, the results of what the heart will do can be known apart from the expression of God's creative decree. Take it.
So again, he says what the heart will do. That's future indicative, right? It's not the subjunctive conditional. The subjunctive conditional is what the heart would do. And this is so important because change of one word alters the situation entirely.
Mhm.
So prior to the decree, there simply is no fact of the matter about what will actually happen because God hasn't even decided to create yet. So middle knowledge is pre-decree, and it doesn't deal with what the heart will do. It deals with what the heart would do were God to
Mhm.
create it.
Yeah.
So the only reason to think that God cannot know what a heart would do pre-decree is to say that either God's ability to create libertarianly free creatures is logically incoherent, or that there simply is no truth value to these subjunctive conditionals until the time of choosing. And I don't think White wants to go with the latter option since that's open theism.
Right.
So, and he certainly hasn't demonstrated the former, mainly because he isn't even dealing with the concept of libertarian freedom in order to say that it's logically incoherent. So, which is he going to go with here?
Yeah.
Yeah. So, and let me just add, we do affirm that God knows truths apart from the decree. According to White, there simply are no truths without God's creating them. So if God decided not to create, listen to this, if God decided not to create, on White's view, then there would be no truths and God would know nothing.
Wow.
Let me repeat that. So if God created all truths and God decided not to create, then there would be no truths and God would know nothing. In fact, it gets even worse than that, because in order to say that God created all truths, he would have to say, if White was being consistent, that there was a state of affairs in which God actually didn't know anything.
Yeah.
Since God has to first exist in order to create truth. And if he creates truth, then there was a state of affairs prior to the creation of those truths. So God could not have known those truths in order to know anything.
Well,
And that's
I mean, he
that's
thinks,
absurd, yeah, and unbiblical.
yeah, and he thinks open theism is bad, but this is far more radical, right?
Yeah.
And I've never met a Calvinist who rejected God's natural knowledge, but it seems, according to James White, it seems that he not only rejects divine middle knowledge, but he also seems to reject God's pre-volitional natural knowledge, because God would have to create those truths as well. So before creating anything, according to James White, God knows nothing. And
Yeah,
White
don't do universal possibilism, kids. Just say no.
yeah, that's right. Just say no. Yeah, and probably White will assert out of one side of his mouth that God has natural knowledge, but what is implied out of the other side of his mouth is a rejection of all knowledge, including natural knowledge. And again, I hope people just see how radical White's view is. No theologian ought to hold White's radical view. Just say no. All right, White continues at 23:55. He says, so he who fashions the hearts of them all understands all their works. So the biblical assertion is that he understands what flows out of the heart because he fashions the heart. He has perfect knowledge of what comes out of the heart because he's the fashioner, the molder of the heart. What say you?
Yeah, and note that it says God fashions the hearts and understands their works. It doesn't say he causally determines their
Right.
works. So again, he has to read causal determinism into the language of fashioning in order to maintain this as a proof text, but that's not at all what is suggested here in the passage. That's way overreading what's actually there.
Yeah. And as Dr. Craig has said, the one who dismisses philosophy is the one most apt to be confused by it. At 24:37, White says, there's no place for middle knowledge here, none. There is nothing in this psalm that does not fit into a two-knowledge understanding, natural and free. Nothing, absolutely nothing. Okay, so now he wants to affirm natural knowledge, but go ahead.
Yeah. So he completely veers off course here. He's forgotten the whole point of what's going on, right? He's supposed to be showing that Psalm 33 is a proof text against Molinism by showing that it precludes libertarian freedom.
Yeah.
But of course, Molinism isn't the only system that affirms libertarian freedom.
Mm-hmm.
Both the open theist and simple foreknowledge views also affirm the possibility of libertarian freedom. And both of them lack middle knowledge. So you can't just say it undermines libertarian freedom by claiming that God only has natural and free knowledge.
Yeah.
That doesn't follow.
Right.
So yeah, he's completely lost the thread here. Like he's supposed to be showing that there's no libertarian freedom because of the text, and he's shown that he doesn't understand libertarian freedom, and definitely hasn't shown that the text precludes it.
Yeah, and you mentioned that both open theists and the simple foreknowledge folks also affirm libertarian freedom, and that they both lack middle knowledge. And I just want to note that many Calvinists, at least some Calvinists, reject White's extreme. Well, I would say many Calvinists would reject White's extreme and radical views that he's given here, this universal possibilism and truth maker maximalism, but also many of them would reject ED, that exhaustive divine determinism. Indeed, depending on the day that you talk to him, it seems that John Calvin himself would reject what this ED view. Again, Calvin seems to be kind of inconsistent. So that's why I say depending on the day that you talk to him. But the point is that White belongs to a small sect, if you will, of those who believe in ED. But many Calvinists reject ED, and in some Calvinists, you can be a 5-point Calvinist and reject ED Calvinism and also affirm middle knowledge. And in fact, earlier this week, a couple nights ago, my friend and colleague at Trinity Theological Seminary, Chris Date, announced that he's a Calvinist who affirms God's middle knowledge. He might nuance that a bit. But yeah, point being, you can be a Calvinist and still affirm middle knowledge. It's possible to do so, and they exist. But anyway, what would you add, Tyson?
Yeah, and I would just note, like, where is White getting these categories of natural and free knowledge? Right? He just said that he affirms those, that you can get everything you want out of natural and free knowledge, but those categories are not in the text.
Yeah.
And he's claimed over and over, he's just reading his theology straight out of the text.
Right.
Where is that in the text?
Yeah.
Of course, it's not there. He's getting them from other people who have reflected philosophically on theology and arrived at these categories.
Yeah, and that's right. And these logical
tradition, he just doesn't realize it.
Say that again.
I said he's steeped in philosophical tradition and applying that to theology. He just doesn't realize it.
Right. And these logical moments of knowledge, even that, Ryan Mullins recently explained on this channel, these are from philosophers of the 1200s, I believe. So he's not getting this from Augustine or from Scripture. This is, again, what philosophically inclined theologians were thinking about in the 1200s.
Yeah, and of course, he doesn't even understand libertarian freedom. Like, he's never shown that he understands what we mean by that term. So his claim that Psalm 33 precludes it is just unjustified. I never said that Psalm 33 is a proof text for Molinism.
No.
Right? The whole point of my article was to address whether or not White supported his burden of proof for the claim that it teaches against libertarian freedom. And I think I've shown that he has not carried that burden at all.
Yeah, you definitely have. You've shown that James White has failed to support his claim that Psalm 33 is evidence of exhaustive divine causal determinism. You've demonstrated that Psalm 33 works better within a libertarian context, and you've shown that White does not understand that which he seeks to refute, and thus James White attacks straw men. Well, he continues at 27:12 and says, does the Molinist affirm that God in his decree fashions that which produces the true subjunctive conditionals? What do you think?
No, of course not. Because in the decree, what God is establishing is not true subjunctive conditionals. It's true future indicatives. So to say otherwise is to completely miss the distinction between free knowledge and middle knowledge, between pre-decree feasible worlds and post-decree actual world, right? So he just doesn't understand these conceptual distinctions at all. So he says something like, does God fashion in his decree these true subjunctive conditionals? No. If you understood middle knowledge, then you would not have said that.
Yeah, James White does not understand that which he is committed to reject. It really, when you think about this, it's kind of mind-blowing that he was willing to have a moderated conversation on this topic in front of, I don't know, 100,000 people or something. I don't know how many people have watched it. He's committed to reject a view he does not understand. And It wasn't quite as apparent during the conversation, but now that he's been going back and forth with us, Tyson, it's really becoming clear that he doesn't understand this. And
Yeah.
with this in
I mean, it
mind,
was really clear during their dialogue that he didn't even read Dr. Craig's article on the grounding objection, even though he was planning to bring up the grounding objection in the dialogue. That's just inexplicable.
Right. Yeah, that was apparent, but it's become much more clear since then. But with that in mind, he made a statement. I was drinking my coffee, listening to this to his video, and he made a statement that made me spit my coffee out, and it also inspired the thumbnail for this video. Which, by the way, that was your idea. Great idea. This is a great thumbnail, and all Tyson's idea. So just, giving you a shout out.
Throw me under the bus. Okay, I got it.
No, man, it's a praise. It's a praise. I loved it.
That came out pretty good.
What's that?
I said it came out pretty good.
Oh, I loved it. It made me laugh. I shot your idea to my team that does this stuff for me, and they wrote back with it, and they said, this was a really good idea. And I was like, yeah, Tyson's brilliant. So anyway, this is why I spit my coffee out at the 28-minute mark of this second video. James White says, Tyson James, you stand utterly refuted by the text. On the one hand, they'll say, this is the word of God. And on the other hand, they'll say, but it's not clear enough to know what it's saying. And yet the psalmist knew what he was saying, and the people who read the psalmist knew what he was saying, and they never came up with Molinism. Go ahead, Tyson.
Yeah, well, they also didn't come up with universal possibilism or truth maker maximalism or exhaustive divine causal determinism, right? Again, no one's claiming that Psalm 33 is a proof text for Molinism, right? You're putting those words into our mouths.
Yes.
It was you who was claiming that it was a proof text against Molinism because you say it precludes libertarian freedom. But as we've seen over and over again, you have not supported that claim. And it's not even clear that you even understand what libertarian freedom is. So how can you possibly say that the text precludes it?
Right. Yeah, please define libertarian freedom for us. We've defined it over and over again. There shouldn't be any confusion on Dr. White's part as to what we think it means. We want to hear from him exactly what he thinks it means. We want to hear from Dr. White. Does he disagree with our definition? And if so, why does he disagree? But next, White says at the 29:33 mark, he says, Molina invented it, Molinism, to create a means of, on one hand, affirming God's sovereignty, and on the other hand, affirming man's sovereignty. What do you think?
Well, this is just a gross caricature of Molina's own motivations. You just have to read Kirk McGregor's biography of Molina or Molina himself and Alfred Freddoso's translation of the Concordia, right? There's absolutely nothing there to suggest that Molina was trying to affirm man's co-sovereignty with God.
Yeah.
But of course, I don't think White has studied either of those books. So I kind of wouldn't expect him to know that.
Right. And we got to add that our friend, Dr. Kurt Jarris, who's not a Molinist, has recently delivered a paper suggesting that Molina might not have been the one to invent, as Dr. White says, what has come to be known as Molinism. Now, yeah, just last month at the ETS conference in Texas, Dr. Jarris presented a paper arguing that Molina was not the first one to have divine middle knowledge in mind. In fact, he says that he has discovered theologians discussing what Molina later labeled as middle knowledge 1,200 years prior to Molina. Now, of course, he'd say that Molina was the first theologian to be so precise and careful and discuss logical moments and to be so philosophically thorough. But Dr. Jarris believes that the concept of what Molina later nailed down was around for hundreds of years, over 1,000 years prior to Molina. So, yeah, I mean, he wants to say that Molina, this Jesuit, this Catholic Jesuit priest, he invented it for the specific purpose to counter the Reformation. Well, if Dr. Jarris is correct, that's completely false. But James White continues with a very odd claim about a passage from Acts. So at the 31-39 mark, he says, of course, the reason this wouldn't be rational is because omnipotence. I think he's quoting you here.
Yeah.
Okay, so you're saying, of course, the reason this wouldn't be rational is because omnipotence doesn't require that God be able to do what is logically or metaphysically impossible. And then White says, so again, logically, Acts 4:27 and 28 is out the window. Is that right?
Yeah. Yeah. So let's go ahead and read Acts chapter 4, 27 and 28. It says, "For truly in this city there were gathered together against your holy servant Jesus, whom you anointed, both Herod and Pontius Pilate, along with the Gentiles and the people of Israel, to do whatever your hand and your plan had predestined to take place."
Mm-hmm.
That's what the text says. And what he's saying is that I'm throwing that out the window as illogical.
Yeah.
Okay, so what is his reasoning? Well, apparently he's taking this word predestined here and saying that we don't affirm that predestination, right? We think it's logically incoherent or something, because that would mean that God is not the one causing people's choices or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
But that's not at all the case.
Yeah.
The Greek word for predestined here is proorisen, which just means decided beforehand. So in other words, he planned for this to happen. But there's nothing in this text that suggests that he causally necessitated these events via determinism.
Mm-hmm.
So again, he's reading his view into another passage of Scripture. Predestination is not the equivalent of causal determinism.
Amen to that.
It's just not. Again, this is another one of those passages that's perfectly compatible with Molinism, because of course we have a robust doctrine of divine providence where God plans the entirety of history, including the incorporation of creaturely free choices into his divine decree.
Yeah.
And that's not ruled out by saying that God predestined things to take place.
Yeah, that's right. The difference between the Ed Calvinist and the Molinist is not predestination. We all affirm predestination. In fact, I affirm exhaustive divine predestination. I just argue that God does not ensure all which has been decreed and predestined via causal determinism. So the Molinist gets to have his cake and eat it too by affirming that God is completely sovereign and predestines all things while not causally determining all things. So that is to say, the antecedent conditions in which we find ourselves are not sufficient to necessitate our moral choices, which have been predestined by God. So anytime that White quotes the scriptures about divine predestination, well, Molinists, we yawn and respond, yeah, we know and agree. And White did this in his debate with Dr. Craig, and he's doing it again now. In fact, he needs to do so much more than show one instance of divine determinism, because Molinists don't deny that God can causally determine some things. We affirm that God can causally determine all things if he wants to. But White needs to find a passage of scripture that doesn't exist that affirms exhaustive divine determinism or exhaustive divine causal determinism. Anyway, once again, White makes an outlandish assertion, and at least he admits it, that it's an assertion here. But this outlandish assertion made me spit out my coffee the second time. So my morning coffee is just getting ruined here. But this is what he said at 33:20. I assert that Tyson James's article has been refuted to the last comma and period. There is nothing left of it. It stands fully refuted. Lost my coffee. And then Rich, his colleague jumps in and says, quote, "So I'm getting the impression that Psalm 33 doesn't work for him, because that's pretty much what I hear him saying. It doesn't work for me. So you don't get to use that one. The end." And then White says, "Look, simple fact, I can go from Psalm 33:1 to the end consistently in context and derive my beliefs from it. The Molinist cannot, and he knows it. So what's the only thing he can do? Well, nobody can," he says. "It's underdeterminative," is what he says that we're going to say. And then he says, "That means there's no passage anywhere in the Bible that is determinative enough to tell us Molinism. So all you got to say is all the rest of the Bible is underdeterminative to refute it, and we win." Is that a good representation, Tyson? And by the way, has your article been refuted to the last comma and period?
Well, I will leave it up to others as to whether he has refuted my article down to the last comma and period. I will say to Rich, who chimed in at the very end, I would say that Psalm 33 works for me just fine. What doesn't work for me is White's bringing philosophical presuppositions to the text and then trying to use it as a proof text against something he clearly doesn't even understand.
Yeah.
Right? That's what I object to. The point of saying that the Bible is underdeterminative about a given topic isn't to refute anyone. It's to take seriously whatever the Bible gives us and not say that it teaches something that it doesn't actually teach.
Yeah.
Like universal possibilism or truth maker maximalism or exhaustive divine causal determinism, right? So ultimately what the Molinist is saying is that various points of biblical data are better explained by Molinism than various alternatives. That's it. Nothing more, nothing less. That's all we're claiming. White does not derive his views on things like universal possibilism or exhaustive divine determinism. He does not derive those from the text, no matter how much he stomps his feet and yells and claims that he does. It's just not there. So I invite those of you who are looking for a view that maintains God's perfect power, his goodness and knowledge, and a view that's able to avoid making God the author of sin. I invite you to continue following this discussion as we continue demonstrating how the Molinist view actually accomplishes these things.
Well, amen to that. I couldn't have said that better, Tyson. And so that's probably a great way to end this video and 2021, at least as far as the Free Thinking Ministries YouTube channel goes. Is there anything else you'd like to add?
No, just to give a shout out to everybody in the chat. I've been following along. Shannon's in there. Wintry. I saw who else was in there? Jacob Brown. Haven't seen that guy in a long time. Good to see you. Yeah, all you guys, we thank you for following along and having a really interesting conversation in the chat. And we hope to see you guys on the flip side in the new year.
Yeah, count on that. And for those of you in the chat, obviously we've already gone for close to 3 hours now, so we're not going to do a Q&A period. So if you have questions for us, please comment on this video and address Tyson and I. And you know, if it's a good question, that'll give us something to do a video on in 2022. But we will be back.
I didn't forget to be the melodist. I just don't know that handle. So
melodist. Yeah, they've got like some of these guys have code names, and we just don't know who they are.
Yeah, stop being anonymous. Be a brave person. Have some courage.
Slam RN. That's Susan, right? Is that? I think that's Susan. Not sure, but I think that's who it is. Anyway, thank you, everybody that's watched. Stay tuned. Make sure you subscribe to this channel so you don't miss what Tyson and I will be doing after the new year. So with that said, Happy New Year. Have a reasonable 2022, and we'll see you soon. Goodbye.